Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we go back to the very dawn of existence with the story of the Ordering of Azeroth, when the Titans descended upon a world of primal chaos and shaped the foundations of everything that would come after. Long before the first civilizations rose, before the earliest records of history began, the world that would come to be known as Azeroth existed in a state of primal chaos that defied description. The planet was a crucible of elemental fury, a roiling sphere where the fundamental forces of creation battled endlessly for dominance. Fire and water, earth and air all clashed in titanic struggles that reshaped the landscape with every passing moment. There was no peace in this primordial realm, no stillness, only the eternal warfare of elements that had raged since the world's formation. Deep within the core of this turbulent world slumbered something extraordinary. A world soul, a nascent being of unimaginable power, dreamed its first dreams within the molten heart of the planet. This entity, which would eventually be known as Azeroth, possessed potential that exceeded even the mightiest of cosmic beings. But the slumbering Titan knew nothing of its own magnificence, lost in the depths of an eternal sleep while chaos reigned on the surface above. The presence of this powerful world soul created an imbalance in the elemental forces of the planet. Spirit, the fifth element that should have bound the others in harmony, was largely consumed by the slumbering being within the planet's core. Without this balancing force, the elements of fire, water, earth, and air grew increasingly erratic and violent. The world became a battleground where destruction was the only constant, where mountains rose and fell within moments, where oceans boiled and froze in endless cycles of devastation. From this primal chaos emerged beings of tremendous power, entities that would shape the destiny of Azeroth for ages to come. These were the elemental lords, sovereigns who had risen to dominance over their respective domains through sheer force and will. Each commanded vast armies of elemental servants, and each sought to impose their vision of supremacy upon the world. Their wars against one another were cataclysmic in scope, battles that would dwarf any conflict that mortal races would later wage. Ragnaros the Fire Lord was among the most fearsome of these elemental sovereigns. His domain was flame in all its forms, from the gentle warmth of a hearth fire to the apocalyptic fury of volcanic eruptions. Ragnaros embraced brute force as his primary weapon, seeking to reduce the entire world to molten slag. He dreamed of boiling the seas until they evaporated, of reducing the mountains to rivers of lava, of choking the skies with ash until the sun itself was blotted out. His rage was eternal, his hunger for destruction insatiable. Therazane the Stone Mother ruled the element of earth, commanding the very foundations upon which the world was built. Unlike the aggressive Ragnaros, Therazane preferred a defensive strategy, entrenching herself behind towering mountain ranges and waiting for her enemies to exhaust themselves before striking. She was patient in ways that the other elemental lords could not comprehend, understanding that stone endures while fire eventually consumes itself. Her armies were slow but implacable, grinding forward with the inevitability of continental drift. Neptulon, the Tide Hunter, held dominion over water in all its forms, from the deepest ocean trenches to the smallest drop of rain. He was the most strategic of the elemental lords, preferring to let his enemies battle among themselves before crushing the exhausted survivors with the full fury of the seas. Neptulon understood the patient power of water, how it could carve through the hardest stone given sufficient time, how it could extinguish the hottest flames, how it could wear away any obstacle through persistence rather than force. Al-Akir the Windlord commanded the element of air, ruling the skies with cunning and guile. He was the cleverest of the elemental lords, preferring espionage and manipulation to direct confrontation. Al-Akir would send his minions to spy upon his enemies, to sow distrust and discord among their ranks, weakening them before launching his own attacks. The winds carried his whispers to every corner of the world, and nothing that occurred beneath the open sky escaped his notice. The wars between these four great powers were endless and devastating. Fire and water clashed in explosions of steam and superheated vapor. Earth and air battled for control of the mountains, with storms tearing at stone that stubbornly refused to yield. Alliances formed and dissolved with every passing age, as temporary truces gave way to renewed hostilities. The world knew no peace, only the eternal cycle of elemental warfare that had continued since time immemorial. But even the might of the elemental lords would prove insufficient against what was coming. From beyond the stars, from the darkest reaches of the great dark beyond, something ancient and malevolent had set its attention upon the chaotic world. The old gods, entities of corruption and madness, spawned by the mysterious Void Lords, plummeted from the heavens and embedded themselves in the surface of primordial Kalimdor. Their arrival would change everything. The nature of the elemental lords extended far beyond their individual domains. Each was a manifestation of their element in its purest and most concentrated form, living embodiments of forces that had existed since the birth of the cosmos. Their physical forms, though terrible to behold, were merely expressions of power that extended throughout the entire world wherever their element was present. When Ragnaros raged, every flame on Azeroth burned a little brighter. When Neptulon stirred, the tides responded to his will across every ocean and river. This interconnection meant that their wars affected not just the battlefields where their armies clashed, but the fundamental nature of the world itself. The servants of the elemental lords were as diverse as the elements they represented. Fire elementals ranged from flickering wisps that danced through volcanic vents to towering infernals whose footsteps left molten glass in their wake. Water elementals could be gentle currents in underground streams or massive waves that crashed against the shores with the force of hurricanes. Earth elementals varied from small stones that tumbled down hillsides to massive golems that stood as tall as mountains. And air elementals encompassed everything from gentle breezes to devastating tornadoes that could strip flesh from bone. These elemental armies fought with a savagery that knew no limits, for they could not truly die in the permanent sense that mortals understand death. When an elemental was destroyed, its essence would eventually reform, drawn back together by the eternal nature of its element. This meant that the wars between the elemental lords were truly endless, cycles of destruction and reformation that would continue for as long as the elements themselves existed. There was no final victory possible, only temporary advantage that would inevitably be reversed. The landscape of primordial Azeroth reflected this constant warfare. Mountains rose and fell with each clash between earth and fire elementals. Oceans advanced and retreated as water and earth struggled for dominance. Hurricanes swept across the land where air and water elementals battled, while volcanic eruptions marked the conflicts between fire and earth. The world was a canvas upon which the elements painted their eternal war, each brushstroke a catastrophe that reshaped continents. The old gods were beings of nightmare given form, entities whose very existence defied the natural order of creation. They did not evolve or grow like other creatures, but seemed to have sprung fully formed from the darkest corners of existence. 4 of these cosmic horrors claimed Azeroth as their own. Y'Shaarj, whose 7 heads dripped with malevolence and whose power exceeded all others. S'Thun, the god of chaos whose 1,000 eyes saw all that occurred within its domain. Yogg-Saron, the god of death whose whispers drove the strongest minds to madness. And N'Zoth, the corrupter whose subtle manipulations would prove the most insidious of all. The impact of the old gods upon Azeroth was immediate and catastrophic. From their forms, which had burrowed deep into the planet's crust, emerged armies of servants dedicated to their dark masters. The N'Raki, shadowy beings that mortals would later call faceless ones, swarmed across the land in numbers beyond counting. The Aqir, insectoid creatures of terrible intelligence and implacable purpose, built vast cities that blotted out the sun. Together, these servants of the old gods constructed what would become known as the Black Empire, a dominion of suffering that encompassed the entire world. The elemental lords, despite their eternal rivalries, recognized the threat that the old gods posed to their own dominion. For the first time in Azeroth's history, the 4 great elementals set aside their differences and united against a common enemy. The war that followed was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed, as the combined might of fire, water, earth, and air crashed against the growing power of the Black Empire. The elemental armies achieved stunning victories in the early stages of the conflict. Al-Aqir and Ragnaros cooperated to create blistering firestorms that reduced the citadels of the Black Empire to ash and cinders. Therazane raised jagged walls of stone to corral the N'Raki and Aqir, channeling them into kill zones where they could be destroyed in vast numbers. Neptulon brought the fury of the seas to bear against the Dark Empire, crushing its coastal fortresses beneath waves that rose higher than mountains. But the old gods were not so easily defeated. No matter how many N'Raki and Aqir the elementals destroyed, more emerged from the putrid forms of their dark masters, like larvae from a hive. The servants of the old gods were endless. Their numbers replenished faster than they could be killed. Slowly, inexorably, the tide of the war began to turn against the elemental lords. The old gods did not merely seek to defeat the elementals, but to corrupt and enslave them. Through whispered promises and dark pacts, through force of will that transcended physical might, the old gods bent the elemental lords to their service. And one by one, the great elementals fell under the sway of their new masters. The entities that had once fought against the Black Empire became its most powerful lieutenants, their awesome might now directed in service to the very corruption they had once opposed. With the elementals enslaved, nothing remained to challenge the dominion of the old gods. The Black Empire spread across the entire world, transforming Azeroth into a realm of unending suffering and darkness. The N'Raki and Aqir ruled the surface, while the old gods themselves brooded in their vast citadels, drinking in the misery of a world they had utterly conquered. Life that was not corrupted was extinguished, and hope itself seemed to have died. The structures of the Black Empire defied mortal comprehension. Great ziggurats rose toward blood-red skies, their stones carved with symbols that drove viewers to madness merely by looking upon them. Rivers of ichor flowed through cities where shadows moved of their own accord, and where the boundary between the waking world and nightmare had been abolished entirely. The old gods reshaped reality itself according to their whims, creating a world that reflected their alien consciousness. For untold ages, the Black Empire reigned supreme. The slumbering world soul in the planet's core dreamed troubled dreams, its vast potential slowly being corrupted by the presence of the old gods above. Had nothing intervened, Azeroth might have awakened as a dark titan, an entity of corruption and destruction that would have threatened the very fabric of reality. The Void Lords who had created the old gods dreamed of such an outcome, of a champion powerful enough to unmake all of creation. The Void Lords who had created the old gods remained in the darkness beyond creation, entities so terrible that even the old gods were merely their servants and instruments. These beings of absolute entropy sought nothing less than the unmaking of all reality, the return of existence to the formless void from which it had emerged. They could not enter the material universe directly, for the light and order that permeated creation were anathema to their nature, but they could send their servants, the old gods, to corrupt worlds from within, turning the very forces of creation against itself. The arrival of the old gods on Azeroth was not random chance, but deliberate design. The Void Lords had detected the presence of the slumbering world soul, had sensed its extraordinary potential, and had dispatched their servants to claim it before the Titans could. A corrupted Azeroth would become the ultimate weapon against all of creation, a dark titan of such power that nothing could stand against it. The Void Lords played a long game, measured in ages rather than years, and they were willing to invest millennia in the corruption of this single world soul. The methods by which the old gods corrupted the elemental lords revealed the true horror of their nature. They did not simply overpower the elementals through force, but twisted their very essences, making them believe that service to the Black Empire was their own choice. The old gods spoke to each elemental lord in a different voice, offering different temptations tailored to their individual natures. To Ragnaros they promised unlimited destruction. To Alakir they offered dominion over all who breathed air. To Neptulon and Therazane they whispered of eternal power and freedom from their rivals. Once enslaved, the elemental lords were bound to their new masters through chains of corruption that reached into the very core of their beings. They could not rebel, even if they wished to, for the old gods had made their service as natural as breathing. The elementals who had once fought for dominion over the world now fought for masters who cared nothing for elemental power, except as a tool to advance their own designs. The first great betrayal of Azeroth had been accomplished, and the world descended into an age of darkness. But the universe held forces that even the old gods had not accounted for. Across the vastness of the great dark beyond, titanic beings of order and creation were approaching, drawn by the faint echoes of Azeroth's troubled dreams. The Titans were coming, and with their arrival, everything would change. The Titans were beings beyond mortal comprehension, entities of such immense power that entire worlds seemed insignificant beside their cosmic forms. They had awakened from world souls themselves, nascent beings that had matured within the cores of planets before emerging as gods of creation and order. The first of these mighty beings, Amonthul the High Father, had awakened in ages so distant that even he could not recall their passing. In the eons since, he had discovered other world souls and nurtured them to awakening, gathering them into a council that would come to be known as the Pantheon. The Pantheon consisted of 7 Titans, each embodying a different aspect of creation. Amonthul himself represented leadership and the mastery of time, his wisdom guiding the others in their eternal mission. Eonar the Lifebinder was his consort and closest advisor, the embodiment of nature and life itself. Khazgoroth the Shaper wielded the power to forge mountains and carve continents, his mastery over earth and flame unmatched by any other Titan. Norgannon the Dreamweaver kept the secrets of magic and knowledge, his vast intellect encompassing the mysteries of the cosmos. Golganath the Thunderer commanded the elements of air and water, his storms sweeping across the stars themselves. Agramar the Avenger was the mightiest warrior of the Pantheon, a being of such martial prowess that he had once fought alongside Sargeras himself in battles against the demonic forces of the twisting Nether. And Sargeras, the Fallen One, had once been the greatest champion of the Pantheon before he turned against his brethren and began his burning crusade to unmake all of creation. The story of Sargeras's fall deserves particular attention, for it shaped the fate of countless worlds across the cosmos and would eventually threaten Azeroth itself. In the earliest days of the Pantheon, Sargeras had been the mightiest of all Titans, a being of bronze skin and golden eyes who burned with the fire of 1,000 suns. He was named the Great Defender of the Pantheon, charged with protecting the worlds they had blessed from the demonic forces that threatened to corrupt them. For eons beyond counting, Sargeras and his apprentice Agramar stood in the vanguard against the demons of the twisting Nether. These chaotic beings emerged from the spaces between worlds, drawn to the order that the Titans imposed upon the cosmos like moths to a flame. They sought to corrupt and destroy everything the Pantheon had built, and Sargeras fought them with a passion born of genuine benevolence. He believed in the great work of his siblings, in the mission to nurture world souls and bring order to chaos. The demons were endless in their variety and their malice. Some were towering infernals of living flame, others were cunning Nathrezim who preferred corruption to direct confrontation. Sargeras destroyed them by the millions, imprisoning those he could not destroy on a prison world called Mardum. For ages, this arrangement served the Pantheon well, keeping the demonic threat contained while they pursued their sacred mission across the stars. But Sargeras's duty exposed him to truths that the other Titans never had to face. In his endless battles against the demons, he discovered worlds that had been infected by something far worse than demons, something that made even the most powerful Fel Lords seem like gnats by comparison. He found world souls that had been corrupted by the old gods, nascent Titans whose potential had been twisted toward destruction rather than creation. The Nathrezim, those cunning demons who had studied the ways of corruption for millennia, revealed to Sargeras the existence of the Void Lords and their ultimate design. These beings of absolute darkness could not enter the material universe directly, but they had found a way to threaten all of creation nonetheless. By sending old gods to corrupt world souls before they could awaken, the Void Lords hoped to create a dark titan, a being of such immense power that it could unmake reality itself. Sargeras was horrified by this revelation. He understood, as perhaps no other titan could, what a dark titan would mean for the universe. Such a being would possess all the power of a fully awakened world soul, but that power would be bent toward destruction rather than creation. Even the combined might of the Pantheon would not be able to stand against such an entity. All of their work, all of the worlds they had shaped, and the life they had nurtured would be swept away like dust before a hurricane. When Sargeras found a world soul that had already been infected by old gods, he faced an impossible choice. He could attempt to cleanse the corruption, but he had seen enough to know that such attempts were unlikely to succeed. The old gods embedded themselves too deeply, intertwined their essence too thoroughly with that of the world soul they were corrupting. Or he could destroy the world before the corruption could spread, killing the nascent titan, but preventing it from becoming a weapon for the Void Lords. In the end, Sargeras chose destruction. He cleaved the corrupted world in two with a single stroke of his blade, killing the world soul within before it could be turned against creation. The act filled him with grief, for he had destroyed the very thing he had been created to protect. But he believed it was necessary, the only way to prevent a greater catastrophe. Sargeras returned to the Pantheon and shared what he had learned, expecting his siblings to understand the terrible necessity of his actions. Instead, they chastised him for his rash decision. They argued that they might have found a way to cleanse the corruption without killing the world soul, that Sargeras had acted in haste and destroyed something that could have been saved. The Void Lords were dangerous, yes, but the solution was not to destroy everything they might corrupt. The disagreement between Sargeras and the Pantheon grew into a fundamental division that could not be bridged. Sargeras argued that the universe needed to be purged of all life to prevent the Void Lords from ever creating a dark titan. A lifeless cosmos, terrible as it would be, was preferable to a cosmos dominated by the void. The other titans rejected this conclusion utterly, believing that order could triumph over chaos, that world souls could be protected from corruption. The rift became irreparable when Sargeras realized that his siblings would never agree to his proposed solution. He departed from the Pantheon and did not return, instead journeying back to the prison world of Mardom, where he had imprisoned so many demons over the ages. There, in an act of madness and despair, he shattered the prison and released the demons within. He would use them as his army in a crusade to cleanse the universe before the Void Lords could corrupt it. The release of the demons transformed Sargeras himself. The fell energies that poured from Mardom's broken prison suffused his being, twisting his bronze skin to crimson and his golden eyes to burning green. He became a being of destruction rather than protection, his form now reflecting the terrible purpose he had chosen. From the chaotic demons, he forged the Burning Legion, an army dedicated to the annihilation of all life in the cosmos. When Sargeras eventually turned his attention to the Pantheon itself, The battle that followed shook the foundations of reality. The Titans fought their corrupted brother with everything they had, but Sargeras had grown too powerful, augmented by the very fell energies he had once fought against. In the end, the Pantheon fell, their spirits scattered across the cosmos, while Sargeras continued his burning crusade. This was the shadow that hung over the Pantheon's mission to save Azeroth. They knew that Sargeras hunted world souls, seeking to destroy them before the Void Lords could corrupt them. If he discovered Azeroth and the extraordinary potential of the Titan sleeping within, he would come to destroy it. The keepers they left behind would need to guard not only against the old gods, but against the fallen Titan himself, whenever he might turn his burning gaze upon the world they had ordered. The Titans traveled the cosmos in search of world souls like themselves, nurturing the sleeping beings within planets and protecting them from the corruption that the Void Lords sought to spread. It was Agramar, wandering the great dark beyond on one of his patrols, who first heard the dreams of Azeroth. The world soul's voice was more powerful than any he had encountered, its potential so vast that it stirred something like awe even within his immortal heart. But Agramar's wonder quickly turned to horror as he approached the planet and witnessed what had befallen it. The old gods had wrapped their tendrils around the entire world, their corruption seeping ever deeper toward the slumbering Titan within. The defenseless world soul remained untouched for now, but if nothing was done, it would eventually be corrupted beyond all hope of salvation. Agramar realized that if the old gods succeeded in their design, Azeroth would awaken as a dark titan of unimaginable power, strong enough to destroy even the Pantheon itself. Agramar immediately returned to his fellow titans and shared what he had discovered. The news sent ripples of concern through the Pantheon, for they had never encountered a world soul of such potential, nor had they ever faced corruption so deeply rooted in a planet's surface. The question of what to do about Azeroth sparked debate among the Titans, with some counseling caution and others urging immediate action. Eonar the Lifebinder was the first to advocate for intervention. She argued that a world soul of such extraordinary potential could not be abandoned to the designs of the Void Lords. If Azeroth awakened free of corruption, she would become the mightiest Titan ever born, perhaps powerful enough to defeat the Void Lords themselves and end their threat to reality forever. The potential rewards of saving Azeroth far outweighed the risks of attempting to do so. Aman'Thul and the other Titans were eventually persuaded by Eonar's arguments. The Pantheon would intervene on Azeroth and attempt to save the slumbering world soul from the old god's corruption. But there was a complication that could not be ignored. The Titans themselves were beings of colossal size, so vast that they made planets seem like pebbles. If they were to descend upon Azeroth directly and do battle with the old gods, they risked killing the very world soul they sought to save. Agramar proposed a solution to this dilemma. Instead of intervening directly, the Pantheon would create armies of servants to act in their stead. These Titan-forged beings would be fashioned from Azeroth's own substance, empowered by the Titans themselves, and sent to wage war against the Black Empire. They would be powerful enough to challenge the old gods and their servants, while being small enough to act without endangering the world soul. The Titans agreed to Agramar's plan and the work of creating the Titan Forged began. It was a labor of ages, a project that required the combined efforts of the entire pantheon. Under the guidance of Khazgoroth, the Titans established great forges upon Azeroth's surface, engines of creation that would shape the raw materials of the world into living servants. The most important of these was the Forge of Wills, constructed in a region that would later be known as the Storm Peaks. From the Forge of Wills emerged the first generation of Titan-forged beings of living metal and stone that embodied the power of their creators. These were divided into two broad categories. The Aesir, fashioned from gleaming metal and imbued with the power of storms, and the Vanir, crafted from living stone and granted dominion over the earth. Both were mighty beyond the comprehension of mortal beings, capable of reshaping mountains and diverting rivers through sheer force of will. But the Titans recognized that their armies would need leaders, beings of exceptional power who could direct the war against the Black Empire and ensure that the Ordering of Azeroth proceeded according to plan. And so, 9 of the Titan Forged were selected for special empowerment, imbued with portions of the Titan's own essence, and granted authority over all others. These 9 became the keepers, the chosen servants of the Pantheon, and the stewards of Azeroth's destiny. The relationship between Sargeras and the Pantheon deserves special attention, for it would have profound consequences for Azeroth in ages to come. Sargeras had once been the mightiest champion of order in the universe, a being of such power that he had single-handedly contained the demonic forces of the twisting nether for countless millennia. His duty had been to patrol the great dark beyond, hunting demons and imprisoning them so that they could not threaten the worlds that the Pantheon was trying to nurture. But Sargeras's mission exposed him to truths that the other Titans never had to face. In his endless battles against the demons, he discovered the existence of the Void Lords and their plans to corrupt world souls. He learned that if even a single world soul fell to the Void Lord's corruption, it would become a dark Titan powerful enough to unmake all of creation. The more Sargeras fought, the more he came to believe that the universe was doomed, that eventually the Void Lords would succeed in their design, and that all of the Pantheon's work would be undone. This knowledge drove Sargeras to madness, and ultimately to betrayal. He concluded that the only way to prevent the Void Lords from corrupting a world soul was to destroy all life in the universe before they could do so. In his twisted logic, a universe cleansed of life was better than a universe corrupted by the void. He freed the demons he had imprisoned, transforming them into an army called the Burning Legion, and began a crusade to burn all worlds before the void could claim them. The other Titans rejected Sargeras's conclusions and his methods. They believed that order could triumph over chaos, that world souls could be protected from corruption, that the Void Lords could be defeated without resorting to universal destruction. When Sargeras attacked them for refusing to join his crusade, they fought back with everything they had. But in the end, even the combined might of the Pantheon could not stand against the fallen Titan, and they were destroyed in a battle that shook the foundations of reality. The discovery of Azeroth thus represented both hope and terror for the cosmos. If the Pantheon could save this world soul, if Azeroth could be protected from corruption and allowed to awaken as a Titan of order, she might become powerful enough to defeat the Void Lords once and for all. But if she were corrupted, or if Sargeras found and destroyed her before she could awaken, then all hope for the universe would be lost. Each of the keepers was empowered by a specific titan, granted powers and responsibilities that reflected their patron's nature. Amenthul the High Father bestowed portions of his essence upon two keepers, Ra, who would serve as High Keeper and leader of the expedition to Azeroth, and Odin, a warrior of unmatched prowess, who would command the Titan-forged armies in battle. Both received the High Father's gift of insight and judgment, along with authority over the flow of time itself. Eonar the Lifebinder empowered Freya, a keeper whose love of life and nature mirrored that of her patron. Freya was charged with nurturing the wild places of Azeroth, with cultivating life in all its forms, and with creating sanctuaries where nature could flourish even amid the corruption of the Black Empire. She was gentle in ways that the other keepers were not, preferring to grow and nurture rather than to fight, though her power was no less formidable for that. Norgannon the Dreamweaver granted his essence to two keepers as well. Loken received the gift of guile and cunning, while Mimiron was blessed with inventive genius that allowed him to create wonders of engineering beyond anything the world had ever seen. Both would play crucial roles in the war to come, though their paths would eventually diverge in ways that Norgannon could never have anticipated. Khazgoroth the Shaper empowered Archaetus, granting him dominion over earth and stone that exceeded even that of the Vanir. Golganath the Thunderer blessed both Thorim and Hodir with aspects of his power, giving Thorim command over lightning and storms, while Hodir received mastery over cold and ice. And Agramar the Avenger bestowed his martial prowess upon Tyr, creating a warrior whose combat skills were acclaimed as the mightiest among all the keepers. With the 9 keepers leading them, the Titan-forged armies descended upon Azeroth to begin the war against the Black Empire. The conflict that followed would reshape the world in ways that are still visible today, carving mountains and excavating seas through the sheer force of the battles waged across the planet's surface. It was a war of gods and monsters, fought on a scale that mortal minds can scarcely imagine. The keepers divided their forces strategically, sending different groups to engage different enemies. They understood that the enslaved elemental lords posed a significant threat and that the elemental armies would need to be defeated before the old gods themselves could be challenged. Each keeper was assigned to confront a specific elemental lord, using their particular strengths to overcome the elemental powers they faced. Tyr and Odin volunteered to confront the most dangerous of the elemental lords, Ragnaros the Fire Lord. Their battle raged for weeks across the volcanic regions where Ragnaros had made his stronghold. The Fire Lord hurled waves of flame at the keepers, seeking to reduce them to molten slag, as he had done to so many others. But Tyr and Odin had been fashioned from metal that could withstand even the hottest fires, their forms immune to the very element that defined Ragnaros's power. The battle between the keepers and the Fire Lord was a clash of titans in the most literal sense. Mountains were reduced to slag, rivers of lava carved new channels across the landscape, and clouds of ash and smoke rose so high that they blocked out the sun across entire continents. Ragnaros threw everything he had at his opponents, but the keepers proved equal to every assault. Eventually, they managed to force the Fire Lord back into his volcanic lair, leaving him weakened and vulnerable. Meanwhile, other keepers were engaging the remaining elemental lords across the world. Freya confronted Therazane the Stone Mother, using her mastery of nature to reach through the stone and touch the life energy that even the Stone Mother could not deny. Thorim's storms battered the forces of Alakir, while the combined might of the Titan-forged armies pushed back against the endless legions of Naraki and Akir that the old gods continued to spawn. The war was long and brutal, measured in centuries rather than years. For every citadel of the Black Empire that the Titan-forged destroyed, another seemed to rise in its place. For every army of Naraki that was annihilated, more emerged from the depths of the old gods' lairs. The keepers began to wonder if victory was even possible, if the corruption had spread so deeply that nothing could root it out. But slowly, inexorably, the tide began to turn. The elemental lords, stripped of their master's support as the old gods focused on their own survival, fell one by one before the might of the keepers. The Akir cities were razed, their populations scattered to the winds. The citadels of the Black Empire crumbled under the assault of the Titan-forged, and the domains of the old gods began to shrink as their servants were destroyed. The old gods themselves proved far more difficult to defeat. Y'Shaarj, the mightiest of them all, was so powerful that even the combined forces of the Titan-forged could make no headway against it. Its 7 heads breathed corruption that twisted everything it touched, and its tentacles reached across entire continents to crush any force that dared approach its throne. The keepers threw army after army against Y'Shaarj, but nothing seemed capable of bringing the old god down. When word reached the Pantheon that even the keepers could not defeat Y'Shaarj, Amenthul the Highfather made a fateful decision. He would intervene directly, reaching down from the heavens to tear the old god from the surface of Azeroth with his own hands. It was a risk, given the danger that direct Titan intervention posed to the slumbering world soul, but Amenthul judged that the threat of Y'Shaarj was too great to be addressed by any other means. The Highfather's arm descended from the sky like a pillar of divine wrath, grasping Y'Shaarj's massive form and ripping it free from the world's crust. The old god shrieked in agony and rage as it was torn from the place where it had embedded itself for ages beyond counting. Its tentacles, which had burrowed deep into the planet's surface, were severed one by one as Amenthul's cosmic strength proved greater than even Y'Shaarj's terrible power. The creation of the Keepers was not a simple process of manufacture, but something closer to birth. Each Keeper emerged from the Forge of Wills as a fully formed being, possessed of personality and will that existed from the moment of their creation. They were not programmed machines, but living entities who could think, feel, and choose. The Titans had designed them this way deliberately, understanding that true guardianship required beings who could adapt to circumstances that their creators could not anticipate. The 9 Keepers who received the Titan's essence formed bonds with one another that transcended mere duty. They were siblings in a sense, all born from the same creative act and empowered for the same purpose. Odin and Ra developed a rivalry over who would lead the expedition to save Azeroth, a competition that was eventually resolved when Ra was designated as High Keeper, while Odin was given command of military operations. Thorim and Hodir shared a close bond born of their shared patron, Golganath. Freya found kinship with the wild gods she would later create, seeing in them the children she could never have. But the keepers were not without flaws. The very essence that made them powerful also made them vulnerable to specific weaknesses. Loken's gift of cunning came paired with insecurity and jealousy. Odin's warrior pride would eventually lead him to defy the will of his fellow keepers. Tyr's devotion to honor would ultimately cost him his life when he refused to abandon those who depended on him. These flaws were not defects in the Titan's design, but natural consequences of creating beings with genuine free will. The second generation of Titan forged, those created by the Keepers rather than directly by the Titans, were designed for more specific purposes. The Earthen were shaped to be excavators and builders, their love of stone and metal reflecting the nature of Azeroth's bones. The Mechagnomes were precision instruments, capable of maintaining the complex machinery that the Keepers would leave behind. The Vrikul were warriors bred for combat, their iron bodies capable of withstanding punishment that would destroy lesser beings. Each race was a tool designed for a particular task in the great project of ordering the world. The Mogu were created by Ra specifically to shape the waterways and riverbeds of the region that would become Pandaria. Their stone forms were perfectly suited to work that required both strength and patience, and they served their keeper with absolute loyalty for countless ages. The Tolvir were guardians and lore keepers, assigned to maintain the machinery of Uldum and preserve the knowledge that the Titans had entrusted to the keepers. The Anubisath were temple guardians, jackal-headed giants whose sole purpose was to protect the sacred places of the Titan forged. But the removal of Y'Sharj had consequences that even Aman'Thul had not anticipated. The old god had sunk its roots so deeply into Azeroth that tearing it free left a wound of catastrophic proportions. From this gaping chasm, the arcane lifeblood of the slumbering world soul began to hemorrhage, pouring out across the surface of the planet in rivers of scintillating energy. The very essence of the nascent Titan was bleeding into the world, threatening to weaken or even kill the being that the Pantheon had come to save. The Keepers rushed to address this crisis, sealing the wound and containing the flow of the world soul's blood. Their efforts saved Azeroth from death, but the damage had been done. The pool of energy that collected at the site of the wound would eventually become known as the Well of Eternity, a lake of such potent magic that it would shape the destiny of Azeroth for all the ages to come. From its shores would eventually rise the Kaldori civilization, and from its depths would come both the greatest wonders and the most terrible disasters in the world's history. The death of Y'Sharj also left an unexpected legacy. Though the old god's physical form had been destroyed, its essence was not so easily extinguished. From the remnants of its being emerged creatures of pure negative emotion, entities that would become known as the Shah. These manifestations of fear, anger, hatred, violence, doubt, despair, and pride would plague the land where Y'Sharj had fallen for thousands of years, eventually becoming the bane of the peaceful continent called Pandaria. The remaining fragments of Y'Sharj, including its still beating heart, were gathered by the Titan forged and placed under guard in secure locations. The Keepers understood that even in death, the old god posed a threat, and its remains needed to be kept safe from any who might seek to use them for dark purposes. Millennia later, these precautions would prove to have been wise when the orc Garrosh Hellscream would unearth the heart of Y'Sharj and use it in his bid for power during the siege of Orgrimmar. The death of Y'Sharj and the consequences of Aman'Thul's intervention taught the Pantheon a crucial lesson. The old gods could not be destroyed without risking catastrophic damage to the world they had infested. They had embedded themselves too deeply, intertwined their essences too thoroughly with the fabric of Azeroth itself. If the remaining old gods were torn free, as Y'Sharj had been, the world soul would surely perish. The Titans conferred among themselves and decided upon a different approach for the remaining old gods. Instead of destroying them, the Keepers would imprison them, sealing them beneath the surface of the planet, where they could no longer threaten the world soul or the life that would eventually flourish above. It was not an ideal solution, for the old gods would continue to exist and might eventually find ways to influence the world from their prisons. But it was the only option that did not risk killing the very being the Pantheon had come to save. The imprisonment of the old gods was a monumental undertaking that required the full resources of the Titan Forged. C'Thun, the god of chaos, was sealed in a prison near the region that would later be called Ullum. Massive stone constructs were built to contain its power, and legions of Titan Forged were assigned to maintain an eternal watch over its slumber. The Keepers hoped that given enough time, C'Thun's power would fade, that the old god might eventually sink into a sleep from which it would never awaken. Yogg-Saron, the god of death whose whispers drove the sanest minds to madness, was imprisoned beneath the very fortress where the Forge of Wills had been constructed. Ulduar became not just a bastion of the Keepers, but a prison for one of the most dangerous beings in existence. 6 of the Keepers were assigned to watch over Yogg-Saron's confinement, ensuring that the old god's influence could not spread beyond the walls of its cell. This decision would later prove to have unforeseen consequences when Yogg-Saron found ways to corrupt those very Keepers who were meant to keep it contained. And Zoth, the most cunning and patient of the old gods, was sealed beneath the oceans where its influence could be most easily isolated. Of all the old gods, N'Zoth was the first to be imprisoned after the death of Y'Sharj, a recognition of the unique threat that its subtle manipulations posed. The Keepers constructed elaborate safeguards to prevent the old god from communicating with the surface world, though N'Zoth would eventually find ways to circumvent even these precautions. The Akir, those insectoid servants of the old gods who had helped build the Black Empire, were not destroyed but scattered. The Keepers drove them from their cities and broke their civilization, forcing the survivors to flee to the distant corners of the world. These refugees would eventually evolve into distinct species: the Chiraji, who settled near C'Thun's prison, the Nerubians, who made their home near Yogg-Saron's, and the Mantid, who remained near the remains of Y'Sharj. All would continue to venerate their imprisoned masters, awaiting the day when the old gods might rise again. With the old gods imprisoned and the Black Empire broken, the Keepers turned their attention to the enslaved elemental lords who had served as the old gods' lieutenants. These beings could not simply be released, for their power was too great and their natures too chaotic to allow them to roam freely across the world. At the same time, the Keepers recognized that the elemental lords were bound to Azeroth itself and could not be permanently destroyed. If killed, their forms would eventually reconstitute, and the cycle of elemental warfare would begin anew. Highkeeper Ra devised an elegant solution to this problem. Working with the Titan-forged sorceress Helia, who possessed powers of dimensional manipulation that exceeded even those of some keepers, Ra created a pocket dimension separate from the material world. This realm, which came to be known as the Elemental Plane, would serve as a prison for the elemental lords and their servants, keeping them contained while allowing them to continue existing. The elemental plane was divided into 4 domains, each corresponding to one of the elemental lords and their respective elements. The Firelands became the prison of Ragnaros, a realm of eternal flame where the Fire Lord could rage to his heart's content without threatening the material world. Deepholm was crafted for Therazane, a domain of endless stone and mineral where the Stone Mother could retreat into her natural element. The Skywall belonged to Alakir, an infinite expanse of open air and eternal storms, and the Abyssal Maw was given to Neptulon, a vast underwater realm where the Tidehunter could command his aquatic legions. Each of these 4 domains was designed to be a self-sustaining ecosystem of elemental energy, a perpetual motion machine that would never run down. The Firelands occupied the theoretical bottom of the elemental plane's sphere, a realm of unimaginable heat where volcanoes erupted continuously and rivers of magma flowed in patterns that Ragnaros could manipulate but never escape. Sulfuron Keep, the Fire Lord's fortress, sat in a vast lake of fire, surrounded by obsidian islands where his most powerful servants made their homes. The heat within the Firelands was sufficient to vaporize ordinary matter instantly, but the fire elementals who were banished there with their lord found it perfectly comfortable. Deepholm was a vast cavern at the heart of the elemental plane, filled with crystals and minerals of every conceivable variety. The Stone Mother could shape this realm as she wished, growing mountains and carving valleys through sheer force of will. The earth elementals who accompanied her created structures of stunning beauty within their dimensional cage, vast cathedrals of living stone that rivaled anything the Titan Forged had built on the surface world. The soil and stone of Deepholm's continent was riddled with tunnels that extended for thousands of miles, a labyrinth that only the earth elementals could navigate. The Skywall formed a layer in the air of the elemental plane, sitting atop the middle layer of the dimension. This domain was an infinite expanse of open air where clouds formed and dissipated according to patterns that no mortal meteorologist could ever predict. Storms raged constantly within this realm, hurricanes and tornadoes that Alakir could direct at will. The Windlord's palace floated amid the eternal tempests, a structure of solidified air that was nearly impossible for non-air elementals to reach. Of all the elemental lords, Alakir was said to be the cleverest, and he spent his captivity probing the barriers of his prison for weaknesses. The Abyssal Maw was Neptulon's underwater kingdom, a realm of crushing depths and lightless trenches where the Tidehunter could command his aquatic armies without interference. Water flowed through the maw in currents that Neptulon designed, creating an eternal ocean that was entirely under his control. Of all the elemental lords, Neptulon seemed most content with his imprisonment, for the maw gave him dominion over water in ways that his conflicts with the other elementals had never allowed. But even his apparent acceptance masked a deeper resentment of the titans who had caged him. The creation of the elemental plane was one of the greatest feats of magical engineering ever accomplished on Azeroth. Ra and Helia had to create not just a prison, but an entire reality, a dimension that could sustain the elemental lords and their servants indefinitely without requiring external maintenance. The High Keeper's Ward sealed the boundaries between the elemental plane and Azeroth, preventing the elemental lords from simply forcing their way back into the material world. Only through specific weaknesses in this ward, or through the intervention of powerful beings on either side, could the barrier be breached. The banishment of the elemental lords and their servants to the elemental plane was accomplished through a ritual of tremendous power. Ra and Helia worked in concert, drawing upon forces that transcended normal magic to open a portal between the material world and the newly created prison dimension. One by one, the elemental lords were forced through this portal, along with the vast majority of their elemental servants. The process took years to complete, as pockets of elemental resistance had to be rooted out across the entire world. With the elemental's departure, a remarkable transformation began to occur across Azeroth. The constant warfare that had torn at the planet's surface for eons finally ceased, and the world began to settle into a state of relative peace. Volcanic activity diminished, storms calmed, the seas retreated to stable coastlines. For the first time in its existence, Azeroth was quiet enough that life could begin to flourish without being immediately destroyed by elemental chaos. The Keepers did not simply seal the elemental plane and walk away. They understood that the elemental lords might eventually find ways to escape their prison, or that circumstances might arise that required the elementals to be released. Safeguards were put in place, chains of binding that held the portals between worlds firmly closed. Only in times of great need or through tremendous exertion of power could these barriers be breached. Within the elemental plane, the elemental lords quickly resumed their eternal warfare against one another. Freed from the need to serve the old gods, and no longer bound by the struggle for survival against the Titan Forged, they returned to their natural state of competition and conflict. The wars between fire and air, water and earth continued unabated within the prison dimension, though now these battles affected only the elemental plane rather than the material world. The greatest of these conflicts within the elemental plane became known as the elemental sundering, a war between the forces of fire and air that raged at the very core of the dimension. Ragnaros and Alakir threw everything they had at one another, creating devastation that would have destroyed entire continents had it occurred on the material plane. The echoes of this conflict occasionally reached the borders of the prison dimension, reminding the Keepers of the tremendous forces they had contained. Meanwhile, on Azeroth, nature began to reclaim the scars left by ages of warfare and corruption. Plants took root in soil that had long been barren. Animals emerged from hiding places where they had survived the age of the Black Empire. Water flowed in rivers and collected in lakes, no longer superheated by volcanic activity or frozen by elemental ice. The world was healing, slowly but surely recovering from the darkness that had held it in thrall for so long. The battles against the enslaved elemental lords were each unique in character, reflecting the different natures of the combatants and the elements they represented. When Thorim and his forces engaged Alakir the Windlord, the conflict took place across the highest peaks and open skies of primordial Kalimdor. The Windlord sent hurricanes against the Titan-forged armies, winds so powerful that they could strip stone from mountains and scatter armies like leaves before a gale. But Thorim called upon the power of lightning, striking down Alakir's air elementals with bolts of electricity that earthed through their insubstantial forms. Hodor's campaign against the water elementals that served both Neptulon and the old gods took place along the ancient coastlines where ocean met land. The Keeper of Ice found that freezing water was an effective countermeasure against Neptulon's servants, transforming the fluid beings into immobile sculptures that could be shattered by the earthen who accompanied him. But Neptulon was clever, and he learned to keep his forces in the warmer depths where Hodir's cold could not reach them. The campaign became one of patience and attrition, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. Arcadus led the effort to root out the corruption that the old gods had spread through the earth itself. His connection to stone allowed him to sense the presence of Sethun's influence wherever it had taken hold, detecting the subtle wrongness that the old god's corruption left in the rock. But cleansing this corruption was far more difficult than detecting it, for the old gods had woven themselves into the very fabric of Azeroth's geology. Arcadus was forced to quarantine entire regions, sealing them away until a more permanent solution could be found. Freya's role in the war was perhaps the most unusual. While her fellow keepers fought the servants of the old gods directly, Freya worked to preserve and protect the life that the Titans hoped would one day flourish on Azeroth. She established sanctuaries in regions that the Black Empire had not yet fully corrupted, creating pockets of untainted nature where plants and animals could survive until the war was won. These sanctuaries would later become the foundation for the ecosystems that would spread across the world after the ordering was complete. Mimiron's contribution was primarily technological rather than martial. The Keeper of Invention created weapons and devices that enhanced the combat effectiveness of the Titan-forged armies, from siege engines that could breach the walls of Enraki citadels to communication systems that allowed the Keepers to coordinate their efforts across the vast distances of Kalimdor. His mechagnomes maintained and repaired the Titan-forged who were damaged in battle, ensuring that the Keeper's forces could remain in the field far longer than the old god's servants might have anticipated. Loken, despite the cunning that would later prove his undoing, served loyally during the war against the Black Empire. He specialized in intelligence gathering and strategic planning, using his gift for guile to anticipate the moves of the Enraki generals and counter them before they could be executed. Many victories that were credited to other keepers were actually the result of Loken's advance work, his agents having softened targets and disrupted supply lines before the main assault began. With the immediate threats neutralized, the EO keepers began the long process of shaping Azeroth according to the Pantheon's design. This was the true ordering of the world, the transformation of a chaotic and corrupted planet into a realm of harmony and stability where life could flourish and the slumbering world soul could mature in safety. The work would take centuries to complete, requiring the efforts of countless Titan-forged and the construction of massive facilities that would regulate the world's fundamental processes. The earthen, those stocky and industrious Titan forged who had been created from living stone, were set to the task of shaping the land itself. Under the direction of the keepers, they carved out vast mountain ranges that would stabilize the continental plates. They dug deep caverns that would allow the heat of the world's core to dissipate without causing volcanic devastation. They excavated mineral deposits that would nourish the soil and support the life that would eventually cover the world's surface. The Titans had created two primary categories of giant Titan forged to assist with the massive construction projects that the ordering required. The Aesir were metal-skinned giants with power over storms, the sea, and air, their gleaming forms conducting lightning and commanding the winds. The Vanir were stone giants with power over rock, earth, and the furious flames of the world's core, their massive hands able to shape mountains as easily as a potter shapes clay. Both kinds of giants were essential to the work of reshaping Azeroth, their tremendous size allowing them to accomplish tasks that would have taken armies of smaller Titan-forged centuries to complete. The stone giants lifted towering mountain ranges across Azeroth, their shoulders bearing the weight of continental plates as they positioned them according to the Keeper's designs. Where the Keepers wanted valleys, the stone giants carved them with their bare hands. Where they wanted plains, the giants smoothed the earth until it lay flat and fertile. The work was slow but inexorable, each giant's contribution adding to a project that transformed the face of the world. The sea giants dredged out the fathomless seas and lifted land from the seafloor, their bodies adapted to work in the crushing depths where no other Titan forged could survive. These immense but gentle beings were created specifically to help with the massive geographical transformations that the ordering required. They carved channels that would allow ocean currents to flow in patterns that distributed heat evenly across the world. They lifted land from the seafloor to create new continents and lowered other regions to create ocean basins of appropriate depth. The world's hydrological cycles were designed with precision that ensured no region would receive too much or too little water. The giants worked for ages beyond counting, their labor continuing long after the war against the Black Empire had ended. When the main landmass had been stabilized and named Kalimdor, the lumbering giants gradually trickled into the mountains and seas, disappearing from sight as their work was completed. Many entered a state of dormancy, waiting in the depths for the day when they might be called upon again. Others continued their ancient duties in untouched areas, maintaining the geological processes that the Keepers had designed. The curse of flesh affected the giants differently than it did the smaller Titan-forged races. While earthen became dwarves and Vrykul became humans, the giants retained much of their original forms, though their stone or metal skin became weathered and less resistant to damage. The giants who remain in the modern era are shadows of their former selves, their numbers greatly diminished and their power reduced. But they remember their original purpose, and some continue to fulfill their ancient duties even now, maintaining coastlines and mountain ranges according to patterns established in the earliest days of the world. The work was not merely physical, but magical as well. The Keepers constructed ley lines beneath the surface of the world, channels through which arcane energy could flow in regulated patterns. These ley lines connected major sites of power, creating a network that would maintain the stability of the world's magical fields. The energy that had once hemorrhaged from the wounded world soul was now contained and directed, flowing through the ley lines in patterns that strengthened rather than harmed the nascent titan within. For many ages, the Titan Forged labored to shape the world according to their master's design. Mountains rose and fell at their command, rivers changed their courses, forests spread across land that had once been barren wasteland. The work was painstaking and precise, for the keepers understood that even small mistakes could have catastrophic consequences for the world's long-term stability. They measured twice and cut once, as the saying goes, ensuring that each change was carefully considered before being implemented. Eventually, the work was complete, and the keepers surveyed what they had created. Where once there had been chaos and corruption, now there stood a single perfect continent that stretched across much of the world's surface. The land was diverse in its terrain, featuring mountains and plains, forests and deserts, rivers and lakes, all arranged in patterns that would support a rich variety of life. The oceans surrounded this great landmass, their currents flowing in the patterns that the sea giants had designed. At the center of this continent, where the wound from Y'Sharja's removal had once bled the world soul's essence, the keepers had crafted a lake of surpassing beauty and power. This was the Well of Eternity, formed from the arcane lifeblood of Azeroth itself. Its waters glowed with internal light, rippling with energies that could be felt from miles away. The well was to be the fount of life for the world, its potent magic nurturing the bones of the planet and empowering life to take root across the continent. As twilight fell on the final day of their labors, the keepers gathered to name the land they had created. They chose to call it Kalimdor, which meant land of eternal starlight in the Titan tongue. The name reflected both the beauty of the world they had shaped and their hope that the light of the stars would forever shine upon this place, protecting it from the darkness that had once consumed it. The completion of Kalimdor's shaping marked a turning point in Azeroth's history. The world was no longer a crucible of chaos, but a realm of order and stability. Life could now flourish without being destroyed by elemental warfare or corrupted by the influence of the old gods. The slumbering world soul could continue its maturation in peace, growing stronger with each passing age until the day when it would finally awaken as the mightiest titan ever born. Even as the physical world was being shaped, Keeper Freya was working on a project of her own that would prove equally important to Azeroth's future. Freya possessed a deep love for life and nature that exceeded even that of her fellow keepers, and she understood that the world needed more than just physical stability to truly flourish. It needed a spiritual dimension, a realm of pure nature that could serve as the source and wellspring of life across the planet. The Emerald Dream was Freya's answer to this need. Whether she wove it into existence from nothing or merely tapped into and shaped a dimension that had always existed in some form remains a matter of debate among those who study such mysteries. What is certain is that Freya created a realm that mirrored the physical world in its natural state, a perfect reflection of Azeroth as it would appear without the influence of intelligent beings. In the Emerald Dream, forests grew unmolested, rivers flowed in their natural courses, and the land, existed in a state of perpetual harmony. Within the Emerald Dream, Freya planted Gehanir, the mother tree, a single magnificent tree that stood atop the highest peak of the dreamscape. From Gehanir bloomed fruits and flowers of every kind, and new life flowed outward from its branches in waves that swept across the land. The mother tree became the source of all natural life in the dream, and its influence extended beyond the dreamscape into the physical world, nurturing the growth of plants and animals across Azeroth. Freya sculpted many other pools of life within the Emerald Dream, creating sanctuaries where different forms of life could flourish. But Gehanir was the first, the tallest, and the most radiant, a beacon of green light that could be seen from any point within the dream. For millennia, the mother tree served as a source of healing and balance that extended beyond the dream and into the physical world, its influence touching every living thing on Azeroth. From the pools of life that Freya created, exceptional creatures began to emerge, animals of such power and wisdom that they transcended their natural origins. These beings came to be known as the Wild Gods, entities of nature magic who embodied specific aspects of the natural world. There was Cenarius, Lord of the Forest, who would later become the teacher of the first Druids. There was Malorn, the great white stag whose antlers touched the sky. There was Ursul and Ursok, the bear gods who embodied the fury and protection of the wilderness. Seeing these remarkable beings as her children, Freya linked the wild gods to the Emerald Dream, binding their spirits to the dreamscape so that they would never truly die. When their physical forms were destroyed, their spirits would return to the dream to regenerate, eventually emerging again to resume their watch over the natural world. This connection ensured that the wild gods would be eternal guardians of Azeroth's wilderness, never permanently lost no matter what threats they might face. Freya wandered the primordial continent of Kalimdor with the wild gods at her side, nurturing the growth of life wherever she passed. Forests sprouted in her footsteps, flowers bloomed at her touch, and the land itself seemed to welcome her presence. The Keeper and her children worked together to spread life across the world, transforming the ordered but barren landscape into a flourishing ecosystem of interconnected creatures and plants. But Freya's work extended beyond the Emerald Dream into the physical world as well. She created the Cradles of Life, special regions across Azeroth that were designed to serve as engines of biological creation and preservation. These cradles were places where life energy was concentrated, where evolution could be accelerated, and where the diversity of species could be cultivated in controlled conditions. The cradles would serve as reservoirs of life that could replenish the rest of the world if catastrophe ever struck. Ungoro Crater was perhaps the most famous of these cradles, a vast depression in southern Kalimdor where primordial conditions were maintained long after the rest of the world had changed. Within Ungoro, creatures that had gone extinct elsewhere continued to thrive, preserved by the unique combination of geothermal energy and life magic that Freya had infused into the region. Dinosaurs and prehistoric plants flourished in Ungoro, living fossils that provided a window into what Azeroth had been like in its earliest days. The crater was not merely a preserve, but an active laboratory. Crystal pylons positioned throughout Ungoro regulated the flow of life energy, allowing Freya and her servants to experiment with different evolutionary paths and biological configurations. The strange creatures that emerged from these experiments sometimes spread beyond the crater's rim, seeding the rest of the world with new forms of life. The peculiar ecosystem of Ungoro, with its mix of ancient and modern creatures, was a testament to the ongoing work of biological creation that the Titans had initiated. Sholazar Basin served a similar purpose in the frozen north, a pocket of tropical warmth carved into the heart of Northrend. Freya designed the basin as a counterpart to Ungoro, a place where different conditions could be tested and different species could be developed. While Ungoro specialized in creatures adapted to heat and volcanic activity, Sholazar focused on species that could thrive in more temperate conditions before being transplanted to other regions of the world. The basin was connected to Ungoro by Titan waygates, allowing the transfer of specimens and genetic material between the two cradles. This network of portals created a unified system of biological research that spanned the entire continent, with each cradle contributing its unique capabilities to the overall project of seeding Azeroth with life. The variety of species that eventually spread across the world was the result of this coordinated effort, each creature carefully designed and tested before being released into the wild. Freya left avatars of herself in both cradles, aspects of her consciousness that could continue the work of cultivation and preservation even when she was occupied elsewhere. Those avatars monitored the health of the cradles, adjusted the crystal pylons when necessary, and intervened when experiments went awry. The avatar of Freya in Sholazar Basin would continue to tend the region for thousands of years, maintaining its tropical climate and diverse ecosystem long after the Keeper herself had departed. The Maker's Perch and Maker's Overlook in Sholazar Basin served as vantage points from which the Titans and their servants could observe their creations. From these elevated positions, the Keepers could watch as new species emerged from the pools of life, tracking their development and noting any unexpected mutations or behaviors. The careful documentation of these experiments filled volumes that were stored in the great libraries of Ulduar, a record of biological creation that spanned millennia. The Emerald Dream served multiple purposes in the Keeper's plans for Azeroth. It was a source of life energy that could be drawn upon to heal and regenerate the natural world. It was a sanctuary where the spirits of nature could retreat in times of danger. It was a blueprint for how the world should appear in its natural state, a reference against which corruption could be measured. And it was a prison of sorts, a realm where threats to nature could be contained without needing to be destroyed. The creation of the Emerald Dream also established a fundamental connection between the spiritual and physical aspects of Azeroth. The dream and the waking world were linked, two sides of the same coin, and changes to one could affect the other. This connection would become increasingly important as the ages passed, allowing druids to draw upon the dream's power and eventually leading to conflicts like the Emerald Nightmare that would threaten both realms. The wild gods that Freya created or nurtured deserve particular attention, for they would shape the spiritual landscape of Azeroth for all the ages to come. These beings were not merely powerful animals, but primal manifestations of life and nature itself, creatures whose existence transcended the boundary between the physical world and the realm of dreams. Each embodied a different aspect of the natural world, and together they formed a tapestry of life that would endure even when individual wild gods fell. Malorn the White Stag was among the most ancient and powerful of the wild gods, one of the first living beings to walk upon Azeroth's surface after the ordering was complete. His power lay in nature itself, in the deep forests and the turning of the seasons, in the cycle of life and death that defined the natural world. His antlers were said to touch the sky, and where he walked, the land flourished with abundant life. The night elves who would later encounter him called him Aparo and venerated him as a god of the hunt and the wilderness. Malorn's destiny became intertwined with the moon goddess Elune in ways that neither the wild gods nor the Titans had anticipated. Their union produced Cenarius, a being who was neither fully wild god nor fully divine but something entirely new, a demigod who combined the earthly power of his father with the celestial grace of his mother. Cenarius would become the lord of the forest, the teacher of the first druids, and one of the most beloved figures in the history of the mortal races. When Cenarius was born, his arrival sent ripples through the Emerald Dream that were felt by Ysera, the green dragon aspect, who had been charged with watching over the dreamscape. Curious about this unusual being, Ysera took an interest in the young demigod and eventually became his foster mother, raising him within the dream even as his father taught him the ways of the physical world. This dual upbringing gave Cenarius a unique perspective, allowing him to walk between the waking world and the dream with equal ease. Cenarius's children became races unto themselves. His daughters were the Dryads, graceful beings who combined the forms of night elves and deer, swift and playful guardians of the forest. His sons were the keepers of the grove, powerful entities who inherited their father's connection to nature and his role as protector of the wild places. Together, these descendants of Cenarius spread across the forests of Kalimdor, watching over the natural world and eventually teaching the night elves the ways of druidism. Ursoc and Ursul, the twin bear gods, had an origin unlike most of the other wild gods. They were not created by Freya in the pools of life, but were born as mortal bear cubs in the forests of the region that would later be called the Grizzly Hills. From their earliest days, these cubs showed extraordinary courage, confronting predators that would have sent any ordinary bear fleeing. They wandered the primordial forests without fear, defending their territory against all challengers with a ferocity that belied their youth. Freya watched these unusual bears with growing interest, recognizing in them a potential that transcended their mortal origins. When the cubs had matured into full-grown bears of tremendous size and strength, Freya elevated them to the status of wild gods, binding their spirits to the Emerald Dream so that they would never truly die. To Ursoc, Freya gave the claws of Ursoc, weapons forged from Titan steel and imbued with the essence of Eoner herself. To Ursul, she granted a staff that made the use of magic as natural as breathing. The twin bears became patrons of strength and in wisdom, respectively, embodying the dual nature of the bears that combined physical might with surprising intelligence. Goldrin, whom the orcs would later call Logosh, was the wolf ancient, whose fury was legendary even among the wild gods. His savagery in battle was unmatched, and his pack hunted across the primordial forests with a ferocity that made even other predators give them wide berth. The druids, who would later seek to harness Goldrin's power, found that his fury was almost impossible to control, leading to the creation of the pack form and eventually contributing to the Worgen curse that would plague the human kingdom of Gilneas. Aviana was the mistress of birds, a wild god whose domain encompassed all winged creatures that flew through Azeroth's skies. She discovered Gahanir, the mother tree that Freya had planted at the heart of the Emerald Dream, and found herself drawn to its radiant beauty. Aviana melded her own power into the tree, creating a connection that would endure for ages. Every winged creature on Azeroth, from the smallest songbird to the mightiest dragon, dreamed of spending the afterlife, flying through the branches of Gahanir, soaring through its emerald canopy in eternal freedom. Agamagan the Great Boar was a wild god of tremendous size and ferocity, his tusks as long as trees and his hide as tough as stone. He roamed the plains and forests of Kalimdor, and where he traveled, the earth itself seemed to respond to his presence. When Agamagan eventually fell in battle during the War of the Ancients, his blood gave rise to masses of thorny vines called the Razorfin, and from his remains emerged the Quillboar race, pig-like humanoids who revered the great boar as their progenitor and god. Aesina was perhaps the most mysterious of the wild gods, for she had no physical form in the way that Malorn or Ursoc did. She was the soul of the forest itself, the beating heart of nature that connected all living things. She was the life energy that broke down stone and devoured ruins, the force that ensured the forest would always reclaim what civilization abandoned. The center of the web of life, Aesina watched over all growing things without ever being seen by mortal eyes. The wild gods were creatures of two realms, inhabiting the physical world, while their spirits remained bound to the Emerald Dream. This connection gave them a form of immortality that even the Titans had not fully anticipated. When a wild god was slain, their spirit would retreat to the dream and eventually to Ardenweald in the Shadowlands, there to rest and regenerate until they could be reborn into the physical world. This cycle of death and rebirth ensured that the wild gods would always return to watch over the natural world, though the process could take centuries or even millennia, depending on the severity of their death. Different mortal cultures would come to know the wild gods by different names and worship them in different ways. The night elves called them ancient guardians, or simply ancients, revering them as the embodiments of nature's power. The trolls knew them as Loa, powerful spirits to be propitiated and bargained with. The Pandaren would call the four wild gods, who settled in their lands the august celestials, building temples and philosophies around their teachings. But beneath these different names and traditions, the wild gods remained what Freya had created them to be, guardians of the natural world, bridges between the physical and spiritual realms, and living reminders that life was sacred and worth protecting. The Sethraxi, those generals of the old god armies who were sent to prevent the Keepers from organizing resistance, deserve particular mention. These beings were among the most powerful servants that the old gods had ever created, towering entities of shadow and Chaitin that combined the worst aspects of the Enraki and the Akir. Each Sethraxi commanded armies numbering in the millions, and their tactical acumen was the equal of any Keepers. They were the perfect generals for a war of attrition, capable of absorbing catastrophic losses. while maintaining pressure on their enemies. The Cethraxi possessed abilities that made them especially dangerous opponents. Their dark powers could drive even Titan Forged to madness, whispering directly into the minds of their enemies and sowing confusion and doubt. Their physical forms were tremendously resilient, able to regenerate from wounds that would have destroyed lesser beings. Most terrifying of all was their ability to slowly regain energy and return to life even after death, meaning that a Cethraxi that was killed might eventually rise again to continue its dark work. Kithix and Zakais were among the most ruthless and cunning of the Cethraxi generals, commanding vast armies of Akir and Naraki in coordinated assaults against the Titan Forged. These two worked in concert, with Kithix serving as the strategist and Zakais as the executioner. Their campaigns left devastation across entire regions of primordial Kalimdor, and for a time it seemed that even the Keeper's best efforts could not slow their advance. It was against Kithix and Zakais that Tyr would eventually fall when he fled Ulduar with the discs of Norgannon. Loken, corrupted by Yogg-Saron, freed these two Cethraxi from their Titan-forged prisons and sent them in pursuit of the fleeing Keeper. Tyr fought a rearguard action to allow Arcadus and Irenaea to escape with the discs, holding both Cethraxi at bay through sheer force of will and martial prowess. In the end, Tyr managed to kill Zakais, but the battle cost him his life. Kithix survived, badly wounded, and would later rally the scattered Akir to found the empire of Azj-Akir. Another Cethraxi named Mithrax descended upon the land that would become Zondalar, seeking to corrupt the trolls who had settled there. This creature would have succeeded in establishing a beachhead for the old gods, if not for the intervention of Sethralis, a powerful Loa who sacrificed herself to defeat the monster. Mithrax's body was sealed away beneath the sands of Voldun, where it would remain until millennia later when foolish mortals awakened it once more. The war against the Cethraxi was perhaps the most grinding aspect of the conflict. Unlike the elemental lords, who could be defeated in singular confrontations, the Cethraxi fought a distributed war, appearing wherever the Titan Forged were weakest and withdrawing before they could be cornered. Destroying one Cethraxi seemed to have little effect, for others would simply absorb its forces and continue the campaign. Only by simultaneously attacking multiple Cethraxi while cutting off their reinforcements could the Keepers hope to reduce the threat they posed. The discovery that the Akir could be turned against each other was a breakthrough that came relatively late in the war. Loken's agents discovered that different broods of Akir served different old gods, and that rivalries existed between these groups that could be exploited. By manipulating the information that flowed between Akir commanders, the Keepers were able to trigger conflicts that consumed resources the old gods needed to oppose the Titan Forged. These internecine struggles weakened the Black Empire far more effectively than direct assault could have. The toll of the war on the Keepers themselves should not be underestimated. Though they were mighty beyond mortal comprehension, they were not invincible, and the centuries of constant warfare wore upon them in ways both physical and spiritual. Tyr bore scars from his battles against Ragnaros that would never fully heal. Thorim's storms sometimes raged out of control when memories of the worst battles rose unbidden in his mind. Even Odin, whose pride prevented him from admitting weakness, found himself haunted by the faces of Titan Forged who had fallen under his command. Arcadus played a crucial role in the war that extended beyond his famous battles against the elemental forces. His connection to the earth allowed him to sense the presence of old god corruption wherever it had taken hold, making him invaluable in tracking the movements of the Black Empire's forces. He created the subterranean chambers that would eventually serve as the prisons for the old gods, carving out massive vaults beneath the surface of Azeroth with his bare hands. Perhaps Arcadus's most significant contribution was the creation of the Chamber of Heart, a massive vault constructed around the very essence of Azeroth's world soul. This chamber was designed to serve as both a monitoring station and an emergency response system, allowing the keepers to track the health of the world soul and intervene if corruption ever threatened to reach it. The chamber was hidden deep beneath the surface, accessible only through specific pathways that the keepers alone knew. The Chamber of Heart would later prove essential during the conflict with N'Zoth, when the world soul was wounded by Sargeras's sword and began bleeding azurite across the planet. Champions of Azeroth would use the chamber to forge a connection with the world soul herself, drawing upon her power to heal the wounds that threatened to destroy the planet. Arcadus had designed the chamber with exactly such emergencies in mind, though he could not have anticipated the specific form that the crisis would take. Ironia was Arcadus's most trusted companion, a Titan-forged giantess of tremendous power who had been entrusted by the Pantheon with overseeing the construction and maintenance of Titan facilities across Azeroth. She spent millennia analyzing the original master plan drawn up by Khazgoroth, ensuring that every structure the Titan Forged built conformed to the Great Titan's designs. Her attention to detail and her mastery of architecture made her invaluable during the Ordering of Azeroth. When Loken's betrayal became clear, Ironia and Arcadus worked together to preserve what they could of the Keeper's legacy. They constructed Uldaman as a refuge for the discs of Norgannon and for those Titan-forged who remained loyal to the Pantheon's original vision. The facility was designed to be nearly impossible to find, hidden beneath the Badlands in a region that the Black Empire had never fully controlled. Within Uldaman, Arcadus and Ironia protected Earthen, who had begun to show signs of the curse of flesh. Many of these Earthen, fearing the transformation that was overtaking them, asked to be placed into hibernation until a cure could be found. Arcadus honored their request, constructing stasis chambers that would preserve them indefinitely. Mechagnomes volunteered to remain awake and keep watch, maintaining the facility and waiting for the day when their stone-skinned brothers might be restored. As the ages passed, Arcadus and Ironia themselves entered long periods of hibernation, awakening only when threats to the facility arose. They became obsessed with finding a cure for the curse of flesh, devoting their waking hours to research that yielded few results. The curse was too deeply woven into the Titan-Forged's very essence, a corruption that could not be removed without destroying the beings it had transformed. The Ordering of Azeroth required not only the shaping of the world, but also the construction of facilities that would maintain that order long after the Keepers had completed their initial work. The most important of these were the great Titan complexes of Ulduar and Uldum, fortress cities that housed the engines of creation and destruction upon which the world's stability depended. Ulduar was constructed in the storm peaks of northern Kalimdor, a region of perpetual winter where the mountains rose higher than anywhere else on the continent. The fortress was built around the Forge of Wills, the great engine of creation that had given birth to the Titan Forged. Within Ulduar's halls, the keepers could continue to create new servants as needed, drawing upon the life essence of Azeroth itself to shape beings of stone and metal. But Ulduar served another purpose as well, one that was perhaps even more important than its function as a creation engine. The fortress was also the prison of Yogg-Saron, the old god whose whispers could drive the strongest minds to madness. The keepers who were assigned to watch over Ulduar were thus serving double duty, maintaining the forge while also ensuring that Yogg-Saron's influence could not escape the cell where the old god was confined. The Forge of Wills was a marvel of Titan engineering, a device that could draw upon the essence of the slumbering world soul and use that power to create living beings. The process was not simple copying, but genuine creation, as each Titan forged emerged as an individual with its own personality and capabilities. The earthen who came from the forge were not identical automatons, but diverse beings who developed their own preferences, skills, and relationships over time. Many different types of Titan forged were created using the Forge of Wills. The earthen were designed to shape the land, their sturdy bodies and tireless work ethic making them ideal for construction and excavation. The mechagnomes, designed by Keeper Mimiron, were mechanical beings who could build and maintain the complex machinery that the keepers required. The Vrikul were warrior servants, iron-skinned giants who could defend the keepers' holdings against any threat. Each race was created for a specific purpose, contributing to the great project of ordering the world. At the opposite end of Kalimdor, in the southern region that would eventually become the desert of Uldum, High Keeper Ra and his followers constructed a second great facility. This complex housed the Forge of Origination, the twin of the Forge of Wills in Ulduar. While the Forge of Wills created life, the Forge of Origination was designed for the opposite purpose, to destroy life if necessary, restarting the world from scratch should it become too corrupted to save. The Forge of Origination was a weapon of last resort, a failsafe that the keepers hoped would never need to be used. Its primary function was to regulate the rhythms of the earth and fortify the form of Azeroth's world soul, sending healing energies through the planet in coordination with the Forge of Wills. But if corruption ever spread so thoroughly that the world could not be saved by other means, the Forge of Origination could release its energies in a devastating wave that would wipe all life from the planet, allowing it to start again from a clean slate. The two forges were linked, working in tandem to maintain the stability of Azeroth. Energy flowed between them through the ley lines that the keepers had carved beneath the surface, creating a circuit that covered the entire world. This network allowed the keepers to monitor the health of the planet from either location, detecting corruption or instability before it could spread too far to contain. Ra also created the Tol'vir, cat-like Titan forged, who were assigned to maintain the machinery of Uldum and guard its secrets. The Anubisath, jackal-headed giants of tremendous power, served as the primary defenders of the complex, and the Mogu, Stone warriors who would later claim an empire in the land that became Pandaria were originally designed to shape the waterways and riverbeds of southern Kalimdor under Ra's direction. Within the halls of origination, 4 specialized watchers were created to guard the devastating power of the re-origination mechanism. These watchers were each responsible for a different aspect of the facility's function, and together they formed a council that could authorize the ultimate sanction if Azeroth ever became too corrupted to save. Amunai was the Watcher of Life, tasked with monitoring the biological processes that the Titans had seeded across the world. Her crystalline form pulsed with green energy, and she possessed the ability to accelerate or retard the growth of any living thing. In the halls of origination, Amunai tended gardens of exotic plants that had been designed to produce specific effects, from healing compounds to poisons that could destroy corrupted tissue. She was gentle by nature, preferring to nurture rather than destroy, but she understood that re-origination might one day be necessary to save the world from a fate worse than death. Isaset was the Watcher of Magic, responsible for regulating the arcane flows that coursed through Uldum and connected it to the broader leyline network. Her form shifted between states of matter, sometimes solid, sometimes pure energy, reflecting the mutable nature of magic itself. Isaset's domain extended beyond Uldum to include monitoring of magical phenomena across Azeroth, alerting the other Watchers when arcane corruption threatened to spread beyond containment. Raj was the Watcher of the Sun, embodying the celestial fire that the Titans had used to shape the world. His form blazed with radiance that was difficult for mortal eyes to bear, and he wielded power over light and heat that rivaled that of the elemental lords themselves. Raj's function was to serve as the trigger for re-origination, channeling the energy of the sun itself through the Forge of Origination if the other Watchers determined that the world needed to be cleansed. Sadish was the Watcher of Chaos, and his role was perhaps the most unusual of the 4. While the other Watchers represented aspects of order and creation, Satesh embodied the destructive forces that re-origination would unleash. His form was unstable, constantly shifting and reforming, a visual representation of the entropy that he was meant to release upon the world, if necessary. Sadish was kept in check by the other Watchers, his power only to be unleashed when all other options had been exhausted. Together, these 4 Watchers could activate the re-origination mechanism without requiring Algalon's reply code Omega. This redundancy was designed into the system to ensure that Azeroth could be cleansed even if the Titan's observer was unable to reach the planet. The Watchers took their responsibility seriously, understanding that they held the power to destroy everything the Titans had built, while also knowing that such destruction might one day be the only way to save the world soul they had been created to protect. A 5th being, the Edimidian, was created as a failsafe for the failsafe itself. This massive construct was designed to activate automatically if the Watchers themselves were somehow corrupted or destroyed, ensuring that the Forge of Origination could never fall entirely into enemy hands. The Edimidian waited in a sealed chamber beneath Uldum, dormant but ready to awaken if circumstances ever required its intervention. A Watcher named Nablia was assigned to oversee Ungoro Crater, maintaining the connection between that cradle of life and the Titan facilities of Uldum. Her responsibilities included ensuring that the crystal pylons that regulated Ungoro's unique environment continued to function properly and that no corruption from the outside world could spread into the protected region. Nablia reported to the Watchers of the Halls of Origination, providing regular updates on the status of the creatures and plants that flourished under her care. The Keepers also established Titan facilities in other parts of the world, including Uldir in the land that would eventually become Zandalar. Unlike the other Titan facilities, Uldir was not designed for creation or regulation, but for research and quarantine. Here, the Titans conducted experiments on captured specimens of the old gods, seeking to understand their eternal foe and find ways to destroy them without killing the world souls they infected. The experiments at Uldir were methodical and extensive. The Titans dissected fragments of the old gods, studied their corruption at the most fundamental level, and searched for weaknesses that could be exploited. They hoped to find a way to kill the old gods without ending their host, to remove the corruption from a world soul without the catastrophic damage that Amenthul's removal of Y'Sharj had caused. But in their research, the Titans made a terrible mistake. From the samples they had collected, from the essence of the old gods they had studied, a new entity began to take form within the depths of Uldir. This being, which would come to be known as Gahun, was essentially a fifth old god, created accidentally through the Titans' own experiments. Unlike the Void Lord's creations, Gahun was not sent from beyond the stars, but born from Azeroth itself, a corruption that had sprung from the very attempts to understand and destroy corruption. The Titans recognized the threat that Gahun posed and immediately moved to contain it. The entity was locked away deep within Uldir, sealed behind three great barriers that were maintained by the blood magic of the trolls Loa. The pyramids of Atulaman, Nazwatha, and Dazaralor each contained one of these seals, and as long as all three remained intact, Gahun would remain imprisoned. A Titan keeper named Hezrol was assigned to watch over the facility, and a construct called Mother was created to maintain the quarantine and destroy anything that attempted to escape. In the region that would become Pandaria, Keykeeper Ra established another great facility around the Engine of Nalaksha, a device similar to the Forge of Wills and the Forge of Origination. This engine had the legendary power to mold the shapes of living beings, to create and reshape life according to the patterns the Keepers designed. Ra watched over this facility from his throne within the Thundering Mountain, commanding the Mogu he had created to shape the waterways and riverbeds of the land. The Veil of Eternal Blossoms was Ra's masterwork in Pandaria, a garden of such beauty and vitality that it exceeded anything else the Keepers had created. The veil was fed by waters that contained the life-giving essence of the world soul itself, and plants and animals flourished there in ways they did not elsewhere on Azeroth. Ra tended the veil with the care of a devoted gardener, seeing in it a reflection of what the entire world might become once the ordering was complete. It was to the Veil of Eternal Blossoms that four remarkable wild gods were drawn, emerging from the great enclaves of life that Freya had created throughout the world. These four beings, Chi-Ji the red crane, Niu Zhao the black ox, Xuen the white tiger, and Yulon the jade serpent, possessed a deep commitment to peace and wisdom that set them apart from the more martial wild gods of other lands. Freya recognized their unique nature and gave them her staff for safekeeping before departing to confront a great darkness from which she never returned. The four wild gods, who would later be known as the August Celestials, took up residence in Pandaria and became its spiritual guardians. Each embodied a different virtue that would later form the foundation of Pandaran philosophy. Niu Zhao taught fortitude, the strength to endure any hardship, no matter how difficult. Xuan taught the difference between true inner strength and mere physical prowess. Qiji taught hope, the belief that even in the darkest times, light could be found. And Yulon taught wisdom, the knowledge of when to act and when to remain still. Freya gave the August Celestials the gift of speech, allowing them to communicate directly with the mortal races who would eventually settle in their lands. She also taught them to shapeshift into humanoid forms, a ability that would later allow them to walk among the Pandaren as teachers and guides. The August Celestials became the heart of Pandaria's spiritual tradition, revered not as distant gods, but as wise mentors who actively participated in the lives of those who sought their counsel. When the pantheon fell to Sargeras in the distant reaches of the cosmos, Ra felt their passing as a surge of power, the last remnant of the Titan's spirits reaching out across the universe in their final moments. He carefully extracted the lingering power of Aman'Thul from this surge and stored it in a mountain vault near the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, hoping to preserve some fragment of his masters against the day when they might be restored. But the death of the Pantheon broke something in Ra's spirit. The Keeper had devoted his entire existence to the service of the Titans, and without them he could see no purpose in continuing. He retreated into the catacombs beneath the thundering mountain and fell into a deep depression, abandoning his duties and leaving his Mogu servants to fend for themselves. The Great Keeper, who had helped create the elemental plane and design the defenses of Uldum, now sat in darkness, a broken being who had lost the will to continue. The Is, Mogu, without their master's guidance, were struck by the curse of flesh and transformed from stone warriors into beings of flesh and blood. They fell to infighting as different factions competed for dominance, their society fragmenting into warring clans. The order that Ra had imposed upon them dissolved, and Pandaria descended into chaos. Eventually, a Mogu named Lei Shen discovered Ra's hiding place and sought out the Keeper after weeks of searching. When Lei Shen found Ra, the Keeper said nothing, sitting in silence that seemed to confirm that the golden age of the Titans was truly over. But Lei Shen was not content to accept this ending. He accused Ra of abandoning the Titans' work, of surrendering to despair when the mission remained unfinished. Ra finally responded to Lei Shen's accusations, bringing the Mogu to the Thundering Mountain, where he summoned the lingering spirit of Aman'Thul. When Lei Shen learned that the Pantheon was truly dead, he made a decision that would reshape the history of Pandaria. If the Titans could not complete their work, then he would do it himself. He would impose order upon the chaos, unite the scattered Mogu clans, and fulfill the purpose that the Keepers had abandoned. Without warning, Lei Shen attacked Ra, using devices he had found in the Keeper's own vaults. He incapacitated the Keeper, bound him in great chains, and stole both Ra's power and the lingering essence of Aman'Thul. Raden, as his Mogu servants called him, was confined to a hidden cell beneath the fortress that Lei Shen built, a prisoner of the very servants he had created. For millennia, Lei Shen tortured Rodin, seeking the secrets of his lightning powers and the knowledge of the titans that the Keeper possessed. The physical agony eventually broke something in Rodin's mind, driving him partially insane. Strips of his stone skin were removed, possibly used to forge artifacts like the divine bell that was said to be made from the flesh of the makers. By the time Lei Shen was eventually defeated, Rodin was a shadow of his former self, muttering nonsensical phrases and only partially aware of the world around him. The liberation of Rodin would not come until the fall of Lei Shen's reborn empire during the Thunder King's second reign. Freed from his imprisonment, Rodin took refuge in a place called the Silent Sanctuary within the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, attended by his loyal Rajani Mogu, who had never forgotten their original master. Though damaged by millennia of torture, Rodin retained enough of his power and knowledge to eventually help in the fight against N'Zoth, using the engine of Nalaksha to power the Forge of Origination in a devastating attack against the awakened Old God. The Keepers also created and distributed the Pillars of Creation, powerful artifacts that embodied the essence of specific titans. The Aegis of Agramar, the Tidestone of Golganath, the Eye of Amanthul, the Hammer of Khazgoroth, and the Tears of Elun were each entrusted to a different keeper to be used in the ongoing work of shaping and protecting the world. These artifacts would later pass into other hands, playing crucial roles in events like the War of the Ancients and the invasion of the Burning Legion during the Third Invasion. As the physical ordering of Azeroth neared completion, the Keepers turned their attention to creating guardians who could protect the world in the ages to come. The Titan Forged were mighty, but they were also bound to their facilities and their specific duties. The Keepers needed champions who could range freely across the world, responding to threats wherever they arose, and ensuring that the order they had established would endure. The proto-dragons were among the most ancient creatures native to Azeroth, having evolved during the ages before the Titans' arrival. These were not the intelligent dragons of later eras, but primitive beasts, barely sentient and driven largely by instinct. They came in many varieties, from the massive creatures that could blot out the sun with their wingspan to smaller breeds that hunted in packs across the primordial landscape. Among the proto-dragons, one stood apart from all others. Galakrond was a monster of such size and power that he dwarfed every other living creature on Azeroth. His appetite was insatiable, his cruelty boundless, and his strength sufficient to destroy entire armies. Worse still, Galakrond had developed a terrible hunger for his own kind, devouring other proto-dragons and somehow absorbing their essence into himself, growing ever larger and more powerful with each meal. The proto-dragons who survived Galakrond's predations lived in constant terror of the monster who hunted them. Most fled from his approach, knowing that to fight was to die. But 5 proto-dragons refused to cower before the father of dragons, as Galakrond came to be called. These 5, Alexstrasza, Ysera, Malygos, Nosdormu, and Nelthorion, were among the most intelligent and powerful of their kind, and they resolved to find a way to defeat the monster that threatened their entire species. The battle against Galakrond drew the attention of Keeper Tyr, who had been observing the proto-dragon's struggle with growing interest. Tyr saw in these 5 courageous creatures the potential for something greater, beings who might be elevated to serve as guardians of Azeroth in ages to come. He intervened in their fight against Galakrond, his presence turning the tide of battle and helping the 5 proto-dragons achieve victory over the monster that had terrorized their kind. After Galakrond's defeat, Tyr brought the 5 proto-dragons before the other keepers and proposed that they be elevated to serve as champions of Azeroth. His suggestion was not universally welcomed. Odin, the prime designate who led the keepers in Ra's absence, objected strenuously to the idea of empowering creatures who were not Titan forged. He believed that only beings created by the Titans themselves could be trusted with such responsibility, and he refused to support Tyr's proposal. But the other keepers overruled Odin's objections, seeing in the proto-dragons the same potential that Tyr had recognized. They reached out to the Pantheon, seeking the Titan's blessing for the empowerment of these 5 creatures. The Titans agreed, and through the keepers as intermediaries, they bestowed portions of their vast power upon the proto-dragons, transforming them into something entirely new. Each dragon received the blessing of a specific Titan, gaining powers and responsibilities that reflected their patron's nature. Aman'Thul blessed Nosdormu with dominion over time, charging the bronze dragon to guard the pathways of fate and protect the integrity of the world's timelines. Eonar bestowed portions of her essence upon both Alexstrasza and Ysera, granting Alexstrasza guardianship over all life and Ysera stewardship of the Emerald Dream. Norgannon empowered Malygos as the guardian of magic and arcane knowledge, and Khazgoroth blessed Neltharion with dominion over the earth and the deep places of the world. The 5 empowered dragons became known as the Dragon Aspects, leaders of the 5 dragonflights that would spread across Azeroth in the ages to come. Each aspect gathered followers who shared their particular affinity, creating flights of red, green, blue, bronze, and black dragons who would serve as guardians of the world. The dragon flights were charged with protecting Azeroth from threats both external and internal, watching over the world that the Titans had so carefully ordered. The Dragon Isles became the ancestral home of the dragon flights, a land specifically prepared for the dragons and their needs. The keepers established facilities throughout the Dragon Isles to support the dragon's duties, including Tyrhold, which housed Titan mechanisms essential to the dragon's empowerment. Titan Watchers were assigned to keep watch over the Dragon Isles, maintaining the infrastructure that the dragons would depend upon for their sacred mission. Many of these Watchers eventually perished over the millennia, including the Keeper who had been placed in charge of Tyrhold. The Dragon Isles eventually became isolated from the rest of Azeroth, hidden behind magical barriers that the dragons raised to protect themselves during times of crisis. But the Titan facilities remained, waiting for the day when they might be needed once more. The original proto-drakes, who did not receive Titan empowerment, developed along their own paths. Tyr had noted during his observations that proto-dragons possessed an unusual ability to adapt to all variations of elements, changing in both physical appearance and capabilities based on their environment. Some proto-drakes infused themselves with elemental energy, becoming creatures of living flame or crackling lightning. Others retained their primitive forms, hunting across the wilds much as their ancestors had done. The proto-drakes who chose to accept the Titan's gift underwent a more fundamental transformation. Their bodies and minds elevated to match the cosmic responsibilities they had been given. Their scales hardened into nearly impervious armor. Their minds expanded to encompass concepts that no proto-drake could have imagined, and their lifespans extended toward immortality, ensuring that they could fulfill their duties for all the ages of the world. The proto-drakes came in many colors before the elevation of the aspects, including light blue, turquoise, orange, brown, gray-black, silver, purple, and gold. After the empowerment, the dragons who followed each aspect gradually took on the coloration associated with their flight, their scales shifting to match the power that their aspect embodied. The red, green, blue, bronze, and black colors that would become synonymous with the dragon flights were thus not original to the proto-drakes, but developed as a result of the Titan blessing. The story of Galakrond and the proto-drake wars that preceded the elevation of the dragon aspects deserves more detailed examination, for it reveals both the dangers that threatened Azeroth and the heroism that saved it. In the ages before the Titan's arrival, proto-drakes had ruled the skies of Azeroth, primitive cousins of the dragons, who would later claim the title of Aspect. These creatures hunted and fought each other for territory, their conflicts shaping the aerial ecology of the primordial world. Galakrond was the greatest of all proto-drakes, a being of such immense size that he rivaled mountains in his bulk. In the earliest days, he had been a benevolent mentor to his kind, hunting alongside other proto-drakes and sharing the bounty of the skies. But something changed in Galakrond, a corruption that twisted his nature and turned him into a monster. The source of Galakrond's corruption was Yogg-Saron, the imprisoned old god, whose influence seeped through the wards that contained it. The old god corrupted the waters that Galakrond drank, slowly transforming the proto-drake into something monstrous and unnatural. Galakrond began to devour other proto-drakes, an act of cannibalism that was unthinkable among his kind. Worse, he discovered that he could raise the proto-drakes he had consumed as undead slaves, creating an army of decaying servants that followed in his wake. The proto-drakes fled before Galakrond's hunger, unable to stand against a creature that grew larger and more powerful with every meal. The skies that had once belonged to all proto-drakes became the hunting ground of a single monster, and it seemed that nothing could stop his endless consumption. Most proto-drakes chose to hide rather than fight, knowing that resistance meant death or a fate even worse. But 5 proto-drakes refused to accept Galakrond's dominion. Alexstrasza, Ysera, Malygos, Nosdormu, and Neltharion were among the most intelligent and powerful of their kind, and they understood that hiding would only delay the inevitable. If Galakrond was not stopped, he would eventually consume every proto-drake on Azeroth, leaving nothing but his undead servants to fill the skies. Keeper Tyr observed the proto-drake's struggle with growing interest. He had seen many battles during the war against the Black Empire, but there was something different about these 5 creatures, a courage and determination that exceeded what he had witnessed in any of the Titan Forged. When the 5 proto-drakes launched their first attacks against Galakrond, Tyr decided to intervene on their behalf. The battle against Galakrond was unlike any conflict that the proto-drakes had ever faced. Galakrond's size made him nearly invulnerable to conventional attacks, and his army of undead proto-drakes meant that any assault had to contend with multiple enemies simultaneously. The 5 proto-drakes and their followers launched coordinated attacks, trying to wear Galakrond down through attrition, but the monster seemed to heal from every wound they inflicted. Tyr's intervention turned the tide of the battle. The Keeper brought weapons and tactics that the proto-drakes could not have developed on their own, and his presence on the battlefield inspired the proto-drakes to fight harder than they ever had before. In one of the most desperate moments of the conflict, Galakrond managed to bite off Tyr's hand, demonstrating just how dangerous the corrupted proto-drake had become. But even this wound did not stop the Keeper, and the battle continued until Galakrond was finally brought down. The death of Galakrond ended the threat that had terrorized the proto-drakes for so long, but it left behind complicated questions about what had caused his corruption. The 5 proto-drakes and Tyr agreed to spread a myth that Galakrond had been the father of dragons, allowing other proto-drakes to believe that their kind had descended from greatness rather than learning the truth about the corruption that had transformed him. This myth would persist for ages, hiding the role that Yogg-Saron had played in Galakrond's fall. Not all proto-drakes were grateful for what Tyr and the 5 had done. A faction of proto-drakes rejected the offer of Titan empowerment, believing that the dragons were meant to remain wild and free rather than becoming servants of cosmic powers. These dissenters infused themselves with elemental energy, becoming the primal incarnates who would oppose the dragon aspects for ages to come. They saw the aspects as corrupted by Titan influence, as creatures who had abandoned their true nature in exchange for power. The conflict between the dragon aspects and the primal incarnates would continue in various forms throughout Azeroth's history, erupting into open war at times and simmering as a cold conflict at others. The incarnates believed that the Titans had stolen something essential from dragonkind, that the aspects were slaves wearing crowns, and that one day the dragons would be freed from their servitude. This philosophical divide represented one of the earliest fractures in Azeroth's new order, a reminder that not everyone welcomed the changes that the Titans had imposed. The newly created dragon aspects proved their worth almost immediately when the Winterscorn War threatened to undo everything the Keepers had built. This conflict began when fire giants named Vulcan and Ignis, servants of the corrupted Loken, armed a fierce Vrikal clan called the Winterscorn to attack other Titan-forged. The Winterscorn had long resented the other Titan-forged races, and with the giants' backing, they saw an opportunity to claim dominion over the Storm Peaks for themselves. The timing of the Winterscorn War was particularly devastating because it coincided with the first symptoms of the Curse of Flesh among the Vrikal. The metallic skin that had once made them nearly invulnerable began to grow brittle and weak, making them vulnerable in ways they had never been before. Ignis and Vulcan compensated for this weakness by constructing an army of molten giants, towering constructs of living fire that could withstand any attack. The Winterscorn army marched against the Earthen first, identifying them as the weakest of the Titan-forged. Giants outfitted proto-dragons with fiery weapons, creating a combined arms force that could attack from both ground and air. The Earthen's defenses crumbled before this onslaught, and soon even Tyr, Archaetus, and Ironia were forced to flee before the Winterscorn advance. In desperation, Tyr called upon the newly empowered dragon aspects for aid. The 5 dragons answered his call, bringing the full power of their dragonflights to bear against the Winterscorn and their giant allies. Alexstrasza raised walls of enchanted fire that held the Vrikul at bay, her flames burning only those who meant harm while leaving her allies unscathed. Malygos drained the magical essence from the giants' constructs, causing them to collapse into inert metal, and freed the enslaved proto-dragons from the fire giants' control. Neltharion demonstrated powers that exceeded even what the other aspects had expected, raising entire mountain ranges to corral the Winterscorn forces and channeling them into killing grounds where they could be destroyed in detail. The earth itself seemed to obey his commands, reshaping the battlefield to favor the dragon armies while hampering the Vrikul advance. The decisive blow came when Ysera and Nosdormu combined their powers in a spell of unprecedented scope. Together, they trapped the entire Winterscorn army in a mist of temporal displacement, putting the Vrikul into a sleep that would last for millennia. The sleeping warriors were locked in tomb cities scattered across Northrend, their bodies preserved, but their minds lost in endless dreams. The Winterscorn War demonstrated that the dragon aspects could fulfill the purpose for which they had been created, protecting Azeroth from threats that the Keepers could not handle alone. But the war also accelerated the curse of flesh among the Vrikul who had been caught in Ysera and Nosdormu's spell. When these sleepers finally awakened thousands of years later, they were no longer beings of metal and stone, but creatures of flesh and blood, transformed by the curse during their long slumber. The rituals used to imprison each old god were tailored to its specific nature and the location where it would be confined. Sethun's prison was designed to suppress its ability to see, for the god of chaos derived much of its power from the 1,000 eyes that perceived all things within its domain. Massive quantities of sand were used to bury and blind the old god, transforming the once lush region of Uldum into the desert it would become in later ages. The Tolvir who would guard this prison were chosen specifically for their resistance to Sethun's particular form of corruption. Yogg-Saron's imprisonment beneath Ulduar was the most complex of all the confinements. The god of death specialized in driving its victims to madness through whispers and dreams, and simply placing physical barriers around it would not be sufficient to contain its influence. The Keepers developed a system of magical wards that would filter and suppress Yogg-Saron's psychic emanations, preventing them from reaching the surface world. These wards required constant maintenance, which is why 6 Keepers were assigned to remain in Ulduar even after the Ordering of Azeroth was complete. Anzoth's prison beneath the ocean was perhaps the most secure in terms of physical isolation, but also the most difficult to monitor. The crushing depths prevented easy access for those who might want to check on the old god's status, and the vast waters that surrounded the prison made it impossible to know if Anzoth's corruption might be seeping out in some unforeseen way. The Keepers trusted that the pressure of the depths and the distance from land would be sufficient to contain Anzoth's influence, a judgment that would prove to be overly optimistic in the ages to come. The Akir who survived the fall of the Black Empire fled to the regions where their masters had been imprisoned. The Nerubians as one group would later be called, settled in the frozen north near Yogg-Saron's prison beneath Ulduar. The Chiraji made their home in the deserts of the south, near where Sithun slumbered in uneasy captivity, and the Mantid remained in the region that would become Pandaria, continuing to venerate Isharj, even though the old god had been destroyed. All three groups would cause problems for the mortal races in ages to come, their devotion to their imprisoned or slain masters undiminished by the passage of millennia. But the gift of the Titans was also a burden. Nelthurion, who had been granted dominion over the earth, felt every rock on Azeroth pressing down upon him. The weight of an entire world bore upon his spirit, splintering and cracking his very essence. He saw his blessing as a curse, a sentence of eternal torment that he could never escape. The foundations for his eventual corruption were laid in that moment of empowerment, though it would be ages before he would fall and become the dragon known as Deathwing. Odin, angered by the decision to empower creatures he considered unworthy of such trust, took drastic action. He refused to participate in the elevation of the proto-dragons, and instead created his own army of champions, the Valarjar, to serve the function he believed the dragon aspects should never have been given. Using the power that the Titans had granted him, Odin constructed the Halls of Valor, a pocket dimension where he could gather the souls of worthy warriors and transform them into eternal soldiers in service to his visions of order. The creation of the Valarjar and the Halls of Valor marked the beginning of a rift between Odin and the other keepers that would never fully heal. Odin had defied the will of both his fellow keepers and the pantheon itself, placing his own judgment above that of his superiors. His adopted daughter Helya, who had helped Ra create the elemental plane, attempted to stop him, but Odin overpowered her and transformed her into the first of the Valkyr, binding her to his service against her will. The story of Helya's transformation deserves deeper examination, for it reveals the darker aspects of Odin's character and set in motion events that would haunt Azeroth for ages. Helya had been a gifted, Titan-forged sorceress who had served loyally during the war against the Black Empire. Her magical talents exceeded those of most other Titan-forged, and she had earned Odin's trust and affection over centuries of faithful service. The Keeper came to see her as his adopted daughter, and Helya looked upon Odin as the father she had never had. When High Keeper, Ra sought to create the elemental plane as a prison for the elemental lords, he called upon Helya for assistance. Her mastery of dimensional magic was unmatched among the Titan-forged, and she proved essential to the creation of the 4 linked domains that would contain Ragnaros, Therazane, Alakir, and Neptulon. The work took years to complete, but when it was finished, Helya had helped create an entire reality, a pocket dimension that could sustain the elemental lords indefinitely. Odin's decision to create the Halls of Valor placed Helya in an impossible position. She had been raised to believe in the importance of obedience to the Pantheon's will, in the unity of the Keepers, and in the rightness of the work they had been charged to complete. When Odin ordered her to tear a section of Ulduar from the earth and raise it into the sky, she obeyed, though she had misgivings about defying the other Keepers. But when Odin's plans for the Valarjar became clear, Helya's misgivings turned to open opposition. The Keeper had sought out a powerful spirit called Muehzala and sacrificed one of his own eyes to gaze into the Shadowlands. There he had witnessed the Kyrian of Bastion, soul-ferrying beings who guided the spirits of the dead to their final rest. Odin decided to create his own version of these beings, servants who would ferry the souls of worthy Vrikul to the halls of valor and transform unwilling Vrikul into more of their kind. No Vrikul volunteered to become these soul farriers, for the transformation required them to give up their physical forms and become creatures of spirit. Odin, undeterred by this lack of volunteers, announced his intention to force Vrikul into the transformation, whether they wished it or not. Helya objected strenuously, arguing that such forced servitude violated everything the Titans had taught about free will and the sanctity of individual choice. The argument between Odin and Helya grew increasingly heated. Helya threatened to return the halls of valor to Ulduar, to undo the work she had done and expose Odin's defiance to the other keepers. This threat pushed Odin past the point of restraint. In a moment of rage that he would later try to hide from his followers, Odin shattered Helya's physical form and twisted her spirit into the first of the Valkyr, binding her to his service through chains of magic that she could not break. The story that Odin later told his followers was a lie designed to preserve his reputation. He claimed that Helya's transformation was the result of her own arrogance, that she had reached for power from the Shadowlands and been destroyed by forces beyond her control. He said that her spirit had begged to become a Valkyr, pleading for any form of existence rather than dissolution. This fabrication allowed Odin to maintain his image as a benevolent ruler while hiding the truth of his betrayal. But Helya remembered. Forced to obey Odin's commands, she ferried Vrikul souls to the halls of valor and transformed other unwilling Vrikul into Valkyr, all while nursing a resentment that grew deeper with each passing century. She could not rebel directly, for the magical chains that bound her were too strong, but she watched for any opportunity to escape her servitude. That opportunity came when Loken, corrupted by Yogg-Saron's whispers, approached Helya with an offer. If she would use her dimensional magic to seal Odin and his Valorjar inside the halls of valor, Loken would help her break the chains that bound her to Odin's service. Helya agreed without hesitation. Using the same techniques she had employed to create the elemental plane, she sealed the dimensional barriers around the halls of valor, trapping Odin and his warriors in their floating fortress. Freed from Odin's control, Helya created her own realm called Helheim, a dark mirror of the halls of valor, where she could claim Vrikul souls for herself. She became a queen of the dead, ruling over an army of drowned spirits and twisted Kavaldir, who served her with the same unwilling obedience that she had once shown to Odin. The keeper who had created her had become her eternal enemy, and the enmity between them would continue until one or the other was destroyed. A Valkyr named Aegir replaced Helya as the leader of Odin's soul farriers, continuing the work that Helya had been forced to perform. But Odin never forgot his adopted daughter's betrayal, and he spent the ages of his imprisonment plotting his eventual escape and revenge. The relationship between Odin and Helya became one of the great tragedies of the Titan-forged era, a story of trust betrayed and love transformed into hatred that would echo through all the ages to come. The Ordering of Azeroth had one final consequence that the Keepers had not anticipated, one that would shape the future of the world in ways they could never have imagined. Yogg-Saron, imprisoned beneath Ulduar, had not been idle during the ages since its confinement. The old god's influence had been seeping into the Forge of Wills, corrupting the device that gave life to so many of the Keeper's servants. The corruption took the form of what would come to be known as the Curse of Flesh, a malady that transformed the stone and metal bodies of the Titan forged into soft, mortal flesh. The change was not immediate but gradual, spreading through generations of Titan forged as the corruption worked its way through their lineages. The earthen began to show the first signs of the curse, their rocky skin becoming more pliable, their crystalline eyes softening into organic orbs. At first, the keepers did not recognize the change for what it was. They observed that their servants were evolving, developing new characteristics that seemed to make them more adaptable to their environment. It was only later, when the full extent of the transformation became apparent, that they realized they were witnessing the work of Yogg-Saron, one final act of corruption that the imprisoned old god had managed to achieve. The curse of flesh affected different Titan-forged races in different ways. The earthen eventually became the dwarves, their stone bodies replaced by flesh and bone, while they retained their love of mining and crafting. The iron Vrakel transformed into the humans of the eastern kingdoms, their mighty stature diminished, but their fierce spirits intact. The mechagnomes became gnomes, losing much of their mechanical nature, but gaining creativity and curiosity that exceeded their original programming. The Mogu and Tolvir likewise succumbed to the curse, their stone forms softening into mortal flesh. Yogg-Saron had intended the curse of flesh to weaken the Keeper's servants, making them easier to corrupt and control. In this, the old god succeeded, for the mortal races that emerged from the curse were indeed more vulnerable than their Titan-forged ancestors. They could be killed, they aged and died, they were susceptible to disease and madness in ways that the original Titan forged had never been. But the curse had consequences that Yogg-Saron had not anticipated. The mortal races that emerged from the transformation possessed qualities that the Titan forged had lacked. They had courage born of their own mortality, resolve forged in the knowledge that their time was limited, heroism that emerged from the need to make each moment count. The very weaknesses that Yogg-Saron had sought to exploit became the source of strengths that the old god could never have predicted. The keepers eventually realized what had happened and disabled the corrupted Forge of Wills, preventing further spread of the curse. But it was too late to reverse the transformation that had already occurred. The Titan forged who had been affected would never regain their original forms, and their descendants would be born as mortals rather than constructs. The races of dwarves, humans, gnomes, and others were now permanent features of Azeroth, unintended creations who would nevertheless play crucial roles in the world's future. The work of ordering Azeroth was finally complete, and the time had come for the Pantheon to depart. The Titans had other worlds to visit, other world souls to nurture, and they could not remain on Azeroth indefinitely. The Keepers would be left behind to maintain the order that had been established, to watch over the imprisoned old gods, and to guide the development of life on the planet. Before their departure, the Titans established protocols for the Keepers to follow in their absence. The most important of these was the Algalon Protocol, a failsafe designed to alert the Pantheon if corruption ever threatened to overwhelm the world. Algalon the Observer, a celestial being who served as the Titan's herald, would be sent to Azeroth if certain conditions were met. If Algalon determined that the world was corrupted beyond saving, he would send a signal to the Pantheon that would trigger the activation of the Forge of Origination, wiping all life from the planet and allowing it to start fresh. The Keepers also received the Discs of Norgannon, recording devices that would chronicle everything that occurred on Azeroth in the Titan's absence. These discs were stored in a special chamber called the Tribunal of Ages, where they could be accessed if the Keepers needed to review past events. The discs were considered sacred artifacts, repositories of truth that could not be altered or falsified. With their final instructions given, the Titans departed Azeroth and resumed their endless journey across the cosmos. They left behind a world that had been transformed from chaos to order, from corruption to stability, from the Black Empire to the ordered continent of Kalimdor. The slumbering world soul continued its maturation within the planet's core, growing ever stronger with each passing age. But the absence of the Titans created a void that would eventually be exploited by forces of darkness. The Keepers, left to their own devices, began to drift apart, each pursuing their own interests and responsibilities. The unity that had characterized them during the war against the Black Empire gradually fragmented as the ages passed, leaving the Keepers isolated and vulnerable. When the Pantheon fell to Sargeras in the distant reaches of the cosmos, the Keepers felt the loss as a spiritual wound that they could not explain. Their connection to the Titans had been severed, leaving them confused and afraid. They reached out to their masters through every means at their disposal, but no answer came. The Titans who had created them, who had empowered them, who had charged them with the sacred duty of protecting Azeroth, were gone. Loken was the Keeper most affected by this silence. He had always been prone to worry and self-doubt, and the loss of the Titans left him in a state of profound despair. Yogg-Saron, ever watchful for opportunities to spread its corruption, sensed Loken's vulnerability and began to work upon him through dreams and whispers. The old god stoked the Keeper's fears, twisted his thoughts, and gradually turned his doubt into obsession. The corruption of Loken would have catastrophic consequences for the Keepers and for Azeroth as a whole. Under Yogg-Saron's influence, Loken committed acts of betrayal that would shatter the unity of the Keepers forever. He grew close to Sif, the wife of his brother Thorim, and when she eventually rejected his advances, Loken killed her in a moment of rage. To cover his crime, he tricked Thorim into believing that the Frost Giants were responsible for Sif's death, triggering a war that decimated the Titan Forged. The creation of the elemental plane was one of the greatest feats of magical engineering ever accomplished on Azeroth. Ra and Helya had to create not just a prison, but an entire reality, a dimension that could sustain the elemental lords and their servants indefinitely without requiring external maintenance. The 4 domains of the elemental plane were each designed to be self-sustaining ecosystems of elemental energy, perpetual motion machines of fire, earth, water, and air that would never run down. The Firelands, Ragnaros' prison, was a realm of eternal flame where volcanoes erupted continuously and rivers of magma flowed in patterns that the Fire Lord could manipulate but never escape. The heat was unimaginable, sufficient to vaporize ordinary matter instantly, but the fire elementals who were banished there with their lord found it perfectly comfortable. Ragnaros could rage and burn to his heart's content, destroying and reshaping his domain as he wished, but the boundaries of the Firelands were absolute. No matter how hot his flames burned, they could not breach the dimensional barriers that separated his prison from the material world. Deepholm, Therazane's realm, was a vast cavern at the heart of the elemental plane, filled with crystals and minerals of every kind. The Stone Mother could shape this realm as she wished, growing mountains and carving valleys through sheer force of will. The earth elementals who accompanied her found the environment perfectly suited to their nature, and over the millennia they would create structures of stunning beauty within their dimensional cage. But like her rival Ragnaros, Therazane could not escape the prison that had been designed for her. The Skywall was Al-Akir's domain, an infinite expanse of open air where clouds formed and dissipated according to patterns that no mortal meteorologist could ever predict. Storms raged constantly within this realm, hurricanes and tornadoes that the Wind Lord could direct at will. The air elementals who served Al-Akir found the Skywall to be an acceptable substitute for the skies of Azeroth, though some whispered that their lord never ceased plotting his eventual escape. The Wind Lord was the cleverest of the elemental lords, and he spent his captivity probing the barriers of his prison for weaknesses. The Abyssal Maw was Neptulon's underwater kingdom, a realm of crushing depths and lightless trenches where the Tidehunter could command his aquatic armies without interference. Water flowed through the Maw in currents that Neptulon designed, creating an eternal ocean that was entirely under his control. Of all the elemental lords, Neptulon seemed most content with his imprisonment, for the Maw gave him dominion over water in ways that his conflicts with the other elementals had never allowed. But even his apparent acceptance masked a deeper resentment of the Titans who had caged him. The other keepers fell one by one to Loken's schemes. Mimeron was apparently killed in what seemed to be a laboratory accident, though his Mechagnome followers would eventually transfer his consciousness into a new mechanical body. Hodir and Freya were subdued and corrupted into complacency, losing the drive that had once characterized them. Odin remained trapped in the halls of valor, sealed away by Helya, who had been freed from his control and sought revenge for her forced servitude. Only Tyr and Archaetus recognized what Loken had become, and they resolved to act before it was too late. Tyr confronted Loken at the gates of Ulduar, creating a distraction, while Archaetus and the Titan-forged Irenaia snuck into the fortress and stole the discs of Norgannon. These discs contained the true record of everything that had happened on Azeroth, including the details of Loken's betrayal. With the discs in hand, Tyr and his allies could prove Loken's guilt to any who doubted them. Tyr, Archaetus, and Irenaia fled south with the discs, and a large following of Titan-forged who remained loyal to the Pantheon's original vision. Loken sent Sithraxi, the generals of the old god armies, in pursuit, and Tyr fought a rearguard action to allow the others to escape. The Keeper fell in battle at a place that would later be called Tirisful Glades, those being glades of the fallen guardian, his sacrifice allowing the discs to be preserved. Loken, left in control of Ulduar, rewrote history to cover his crimes. He altered the Tribunal of Ages to present a false version of events, one in which he was a loyal keeper and his victims had been traitors. He also modified the Algalon protocol, setting it to activate only upon his own death, preventing anyone from alerting the Pantheon to what had occurred on Azeroth. For ages thereafter, Loken remained hidden within Ulduar, fearful that the Titans or their observer would eventually return to discover his treachery. The world that the Titans left behind was one of tremendous potential, shaped by divine hands into a realm where life could flourish and evolve. The Ordering of Azeroth had transformed a planet of chaos and corruption into a garden of possibilities, a world where the foundations had been laid for civilizations and heroes that would one day become legendary. The Well of Eternity, that lake of concentrated world soul essence at the heart of Kalimdor, would eventually draw the attention of the primitive Kaldorei, transforming them into the first great civilization of the mortal races. The Night Elves would build an empire that spanned the entire continent, drawing upon the Well's power to work wonders of magic that rivaled those of the Titans themselves. But their success would also attract the attention of the Burning Legion, leading to the catastrophe of the War of the Ancients that would shatter Kalimdor and reshape the world's geography. The dragon aspects, those champions who had been empowered to protect Azeroth, would guide and guard the mortal races through ages of trial and tribulation. Alexstrasza would ensure that life endured even in the darkest times. Ysera would watch over the Emerald Dream and guided the Druids in their connection to nature. Nosdormu would protect the Timeways from those who would abuse them, and Malygos would guard the secrets of magic, though his eventual madness would pose a threat to the very world he was sworn to protect. The corruption of Neltharion, seeded in the moment of his empowerment, would eventually blossom into one of the greatest threats Azeroth had ever faced. As Deathwing, the corrupted aspect would seek the destruction of all life on the planet, manipulated by the whispers of the old gods who had been waiting for such an opportunity since their imprisonment. The cataclysm that he caused would reshape the world once again, breaking the continent into the form it holds today. The old gods, though imprisoned, never ceased their attempts to influence the world above. Through their surviving servants, through their dreams and whispers, through the corruption that seeped from their prisons, they continued to work toward the day when they would be freed. Sethun would eventually be awakened by the Chiraji, requiring champions of both Alliance and Horde to descend into its temple and defeat it once more. Yogg-Saron would corrupt the keepers of Ulduar, nearly escaping its prison before being stopped by adventurers who braved the depths of the Titan fortress. And N'Zoth would manipulate events from its oceanic prison, eventually being freed during the Fourth War, before meeting its end at the hands of the champions of Azeroth. The curse of flesh, though intended as a weapon of corruption, gave rise to the mortal races who would become the true defenders of Azeroth. Dwarves and humans, gnomes and others, these peoples born from the Titan forged, would prove to be the world's greatest champions. Where the keepers had failed, where even the dragon aspects would falter, the mortal races would rise to meet the challenges that threatened their worlds. The courage and heroism that Yogg-Saron had never anticipated would become the salvation of Azeroth time and again. The dwarves who emerged from the cursed earthen retained their ancestors' love of stone and metal, their deep connection to the mountains where they made their homes. They became master craftsmen and fearless warriors, building great kingdoms beneath the peaks of the world. The Bronzebeard, Wildhammer, and Dark Iron clans would each take different paths, but all traced their origins to the earthen who had once served the keepers of Ulduar. The humans who descended from the Iron Vrikul spread across the eastern kingdoms, building civilizations that would rise and fall across the millennia. Though diminished in stature from their Vrikul ancestors, humans inherited their fierce determination and their capacity for both great heroism and terrible cruelty. The kingdoms of Stormwind, Lordaeron, and the others would become the backbone of the Alliance, standing against threats that would have overwhelmed lesser peoples. The gnomes, transformed from the mechanical precision of the mechagnomes, developed a curiosity and inventiveness that exceeded even their original programming. Where the mechagnomes had been tools for maintaining Titan machinery, the gnomes became innovators who created new technologies that the keepers had never imagined. Their city of Gnomerigan, built in the depths of the mountains, became a center of learning and invention that rivaled anything in Azeroth. The Tol'vir who had guarded Uldum and the Mogu who had served Ra in Pandaria were also transformed by the curse of flesh, though their transformations took different forms than those of the races in the north. The Tol'vir became beings of flesh and bone, while retaining their feline features, their society fragmenting as some sought to maintain their Titan heritage, while others embraced their new mortal nature. The Mogu, transformed from stone to flesh, fell into the chaos that followed Ra's withdrawal from the world. Without their keeper's guidance, they became tyrants who enslaved the other races of Pandaria, building an empire upon the backs of the Pandaren and the Hosen and the Jinyu. The Mogu's cruelty was legendary, and their eventual overthrow by the Pandaren would become one of the great liberation stories in Azeroth's history. Even the giants, those massive Titan-forged who had shaped mountains and dredged seas, felt the touch of the curse of flesh. Their stone and metal skin weathered and weakened, though their essential forms remained intact. The giants who survived into the modern era became reclusive creatures, hiding in the deep places of the world and continuing their ancient duties as best they could with their diminished powers. Each of these mortal races carried within them the legacy of the Titans, fragments of divine power that had been passed down through countless generations. Though they had forgotten their origins, though they had built new societies and new beliefs, they remained connected to the great work of ordering that the Keepers had begun. In times of crisis, this heritage would manifest as heroism that exceeded what any mortal should have been capable of, as champions arose to defend the world that their ancestors had helped to shape. The Keepers who survived the fall of their order would eventually be restored to their original purpose. The heroes who ventured into Ulduar would break Yogg-Saron's hold over Hodir, Freya, and Thorim, restoring them to something approaching their former selves. Even Odin would eventually be released from the halls of valor, though his relationship with the other Keepers would never fully recover from the rifts that had formed. Together, the remaining Keepers would continue to serve as guardians of Azeroth, albeit in a diminished capacity compared to their original mandate. The slumbering world soul that the Titans had sought to protect continues its ancient dream within the core of Azeroth. She is now aware of the surface world in ways that she was not before, having been injured by the sword of Sargeras and healed by the champions who gathered the world's blood in the form of Azerite. The day when she will finally awaken draws ever closer, and when that day comes, she will become either the salvation or the doom of all reality, depending on whether the corruption that has seeped into the world over the ages can be purged before her emergence. The story of the Ordering of Azeroth is thus not merely a tale of the distant past, but the foundations upon which all subsequent history has been built. Every war fought on Azeroth's surface, every kingdom risen and fallen, every hero who has stood against the darkness, all of these trace their origins to the decisions made by the Titans and their keepers in those primordial ages. The world that exists today is the world that the Titans shaped, for better or worse, and the challenges that its peoples face are the echoes of conflicts that began before mortal memory. The ley lines that the keepers carved beneath the surface of the world continue to channel magic across Azeroth, connecting sites of power and maintaining the stability of the world's arcane fields. These ancient pathways have been used by mages of every race to work wonders that would otherwise be impossible, though few who draw upon their power understand the true nature of what they are tapping into. The ley lines are the circulatory system of a living world, carrying the essence of the world soul to every corner of the planet. The prisons that contain the old gods still stand, maintained by safeguards that were built in an age before mortal memory. Chthun stirs beneath the sands of Silithus, its 1,000 eyes ever watching for an opportunity to escape. Yogg-Saron whispers from the depths of Ulduar, its influence spreading through dreams to corrupt the unwary. And though Inzoth has been destroyed, the corruption it spread during its imprisonment continues to taint the deep places of the world, a reminder that the old god's influence is never truly eliminated. The elemental plane remains sealed, its 4 domains continuing their eternal cycles of creation and destruction. Occasionally, cracks appear in the barriers between worlds, allowing elementals to slip through and cause havoc on the surface. But the High Keeper's ward holds, preventing the elemental lords themselves from escaping their dimensional prison. The elemental cults that worship Ragnaros and his brethren seek to weaken these barriers, believing that the return of the elemental lords would restore a natural order that the Titans disrupted. They do not understand that the natural order they seek would mean the death of all mortal life. The Emerald Dream continues to mirror the physical world, Freya's masterwork enduring long after its creator fell into the slumber of the corrupted keepers. Druids walk its verdant paths, drawing upon its power to heal wounds in the natural world. The wild gods slumber within its depths, awaiting the call to rise again when Azeroth needs them. And at the center of the dream, Gahunir the Mother Tree still stands, its branches reaching toward a sky of perpetual twilight, its roots drawing upon the essence of life itself. The dragon aspects, diminished by their sacrifice during the cataclysm, no longer possess the cosmic power that the Titans bestowed upon them. But the dragonflights endure, and new leaders have arisen to guide them through the challenges of a changed world. The dragons remember their purpose, even if they can no longer fulfill it with the same power that their aspects once wielded. They watch over Azeroth still, guardians of a world that remains threatened by forces beyond mortal comprehension. In the depths of the world, the Chamber of Heart pulses with the slow rhythm of the world soul's dreams. The wound that Sargeras inflicted has begun to heal, the azurate that bled from the world's veins returning to its proper place within the planet's core. But the world soul's awakening has been accelerated by these events, and no one can predict what will happen when she finally opens her eyes. The Titans hoped that Azeroth would be their greatest creation, a being of such power that she could defeat the Void Lords themselves. Whether that hope will be fulfilled, or whether their fears of a dark Titan will be realized, remains to be seen. As you rest and feel the weight of the day beginning to lift from your shoulders, consider the vast scope of the story you have just heard. The Ordering of Azeroth was not the work of moments or years, but of ages, a project that spanned millennia and involved beings of power beyond mortal comprehension. The world they created has endured for tens of thousands of years, weathering catastrophes that would have destroyed any lesser realm, surviving the corruption of the old gods and the machinations of the Burning Legion. The Titans who shaped Azeroth are gone now, destroyed by Sargeras in a battle that occurred beyond the stars. But their legacy remains in every mountain and valley, in every river and forest, in the very structure of the world that they ordered. The ley lines they carved still channel magic across the planet. The forges they built still contain the power to create or destroy. The safeguards they established still stand against the return of the old gods. The mortal races who descended from their creations continue the work of protecting the world, often without knowing the true nature of the legacy they carry within them. And the world soul they came to save still dreams her dreams in the depths of the planet, growing ever closer to the awakening that will determine the fate of all things. That is the complete story of the Ordering of Azeroth. If you found this lore as fascinating as I do, hit the like button and subscribe. We cover all of Warcraft's history here on World of Sleepcraft, and there is plenty more to come.